Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it's time for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. Okay, here we go. Last roundup for 2024, and whoops, it's another one of my biggest ones to date. 40 reviews, all in one video, though 2 of those segments are of 2 albums mashed together, so it's technically 42 releases on the docket. 3 mini and brief segments on the way too. It's gonna be one of those ones I'll have to record over 2 days. As per usual, don't feel obligated to watch all of it in one sitting if you don't want to, though I've done my best to make sure that these can be watchable for those trying to go through all of it at once if they so choose. Reminder, of course, to please try out a bunch of the 7-range stuff in case they hit even better for you than they did for me. Especially this time around when 7s are like the vast majority of the roundup and there aren't that many 8s, unfortunately. But at least a bunch of them came close, so keep your eyes peeled for those. And if you're interested in seeing my favorite and least favorite tracks on any given project, I got my usual paste bin document linked in the description. But that's about all the prelude I have, so let's jump right into it. Starting out with, from Spunkshine, The Quiet Resonance of a Failing Orbit. Okay, let's kick things off with one of the usual suspects. This is now the 8th time I've covered Spunkshine, and I've obviously gotten pretty used to his formula of quirky down-tempo cuts, sharing time with moody ambience and occasionally really heavy big beat bangers and cheerful dance music abstraction. And this latest album isn't anything far afield of what you'd already expect if you've been following him for any previous length of time. Though if there is any major difference between this album and any other projects of his, it's the fact that he decided to edit himself even less than usual and just dropped a massive 99-minute, 17-track experience on us this time around. Pairing it, of course, with a fake warning of this new medical disorder being researched called Spunkshine Fatigue Syndrome, described in the Bandcamp community post first announcing this album, which was freaking hilarious. Guy knew full well that an album of this length was going to be a massive ask out of any listener. Although, the even bigger surprise was that it actually doesn't feel any longer than what I typically expect out of Spunkshine albums either. It's not all solid gold, and it won't surprise anyone to hear that the album has plenty of filler that didn't grab my attention, but in order to make up for that, he did pace the album a fair bit better than usual, and sequence the tracks in such a way to more heavily contrast each other, and thereby prevent the listening experience from dragging or running together too much. It's nice when a number of those supposed filler-y moments are also 7-minute mini mid-tempo epics with lots of change-ups and evolutions over time, as seen on cuts like An Enormously Heavy Particle or a Periphidious Serenade that could have been bigger standouts on shorter Spunkshine albums, but weren't on this one since they ended up blending into the general status quo vibe. It's a good status quo vibe to have. The album's actual weakest point might actually be the very beginning. The album starts with 2 somewhat forgettable down-tempo tracks in Demand Engineering and Sanctuary that might fool less patient listeners into thinking the album is going to be a lot more of a trudge than it actually is. But once I got to The Secret Life of Dull Objects, it got to be much smoother sailing. The blaring synth riffs and heavy beats on that one were more striking and attention-grabbing than anything that came before. And in terms of other standouts worth hearing, on the down-tempo side I like A Failing Orbit and its melancholic piano and synth string progressions. I like Aggregate Complexity and its much subtler and grayer mixes building into banging hip-hop beats. On the up-tempo banger-heavy side, I gotta highlight Proper Procedure and its funky guitars going up next to blasts of noise. And of course what is probably my personal favorite track, Loading the Homunculus Cannon, which throws so many different crazy, playful sounds at you over the course of 7 minutes. Absolutely nuts in that classic Spunkshine way. Sitting in between the up-tempo and down-tempo worlds, I like An Exquisite Fragment of Something Once Whole and its much thicker and rounder bass stabs, eventually leading into triumphant and epic build-ups. I like A Wonderful Broken Thing, kind of floating from minimal breakbeat workouts into more propulsive and funky sections that all still kind of add up to the same mysterious and intriguing mechanical vibe. And I think the album ends on 2 of its absolute best moments as well. Frozen Giant starts out with plinky keyboard tones just as chilling and icy as that title makes it sound, but the track twists around into lots of different places, including some of the heaviest banging moments on the album. And closer, The Approach is an entirely ambient drone piece, though it fittingly delivers on some of the most epic and dramatic atmospheres the album has to offer and makes for a solidly climactic finish. That's about all I have to say though. This album as a complete whole might be best experienced either as like a beats to study to type listen, as something to put in the background while you do something else, or the kind of thing that you just like pick and choose favorites, rather than the kind of thing that'll really have you like really engaged from start to finish. But you know, it's not nearly as intimidating or fatigue-inducing a listen as it might look on the surface, and it might still be worth sitting through at least once in its full 99-minute entirety to see what you like. I personally like this a little more than his last album, This Supreme Experience, and if you've enjoyed any Spunkshine albums in the past or just need some mood-brightening and empathetic vibes to immerse yourself in for an extended period of time, I can't see any reason this wouldn't be able to hit for you as well. Very solid stuff as usual. I'm feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. Next up from Gabriel Lamar, The Unified Field and Light of Unity. Man, it's been a long time since I've covered Gabriel Lamar. I used to cover this underrated and semi-legendary, for those in the know, dub techno, psytrance, and downtempo artist pretty frequently, and have done multiple Some Stuff I Miss segments and multiple full videos on this guy. Check out my older reviews for his albums Flashin' On and Among Trees I Want to Live if you want to hear more detail on how I became a more in-depth fan of this guy or his history. But the last time I talked about him was his back-to-back album releases in 2021 for Berlin Guitar and Into Sonic States, which I talked about in the Volume 6 roundup. He's put out plenty of stuff since then, though it's mostly just been like supplementary material to add on to other releases, like Transition Stage, which felt like a companion album to his Berlin Guitar album that focused a lot less on the guitars, or Beatless Into the Groove, which was just a big compilation of beatless versions of other tracks on his more recent albums. There was also the one SOPHIE Brothers album called Make Pictures with the Sound in 2022, which, despite technically being a four-man effort, just felt like an average Gabriel Lamar solo album, and I opted not to cover out of a lack of new things to say. But now we've got a pair of proper new Gabriel Lamar solo albums, one called The Unified Field, focused on heavier psytrance material released on Dragonfly Records, and the other Light of Unity, focused on downtempo and dub excursions released on Liquid Sound Design. Directly interconnected through a couple of tracks that had two different versions with one version on each album, like how Unified Field has tracks called Melt Up, Crystals, Route 606 Unified Mix, and 6/8 Spiral Gates, and Light of Unity has downtempo versions of those tracks in Melt Down, Crystals 1 Drop, Route 606, and 6/8 Gates. These albums are also somewhat interesting for Lamar in the sense that every track is a collaboration with another artist on the scene. Unified Field brings in Ace Ventura, Jossie Telsch, Silent Sphere, Mindbenders, Inner Zone, DM Theory, and longtime SOPHIE Brothers collaborator Groove Titan, while Light of Unity brings in most of those same names, but also Asia, Dr. Mate, DF Trem, Jorn Elling Wutke, and even the Orb alumni, Youth and Andy Falconer, which was cool to see. Now, in terms of how the actual music played out, admittedly, if you've heard enough Gabriel Lamar albums in the past, there won't be anything new here you haven't heard before, and both albums heavily resemble that last SOPHIE Brothers album, which makes sense given they were conceived in largely the same way, albeit the SOPHIE Brothers thing had fewer collaborators. It's all groove-centric and vibe-centric. You're not going to have a lot of strong melodies or even that many, like, interesting instrumental textures outside of the usual, you know, like, spacey dub and techno and trance synth blends you'd already expect. But for what they are, I do think both albums are a fun enough time to be worth the experience if you are a fan anyway. And I don't really have a strong preference over which album is better. Unified Field has the benefit of being a regular psytrance record, and thus the grooves are a lot more exciting and propulsive and fast-paced. Though my analysis of it kinda ends there, it's just very good psytrance, and that's about it. Light of Unity mostly sounds the same with fewer or slower beats, but twists those ideas into new shapes that are able to stand on their own, on top of adding a little more variety in textures. I like how the Youth collab in terms of dub had a lot of interesting progressions and change-ups over time. I like the guitars on Route 606, and the mildly more reggae-influenced flavor of the Andy Falconer collab Likewiser. The way Melt Up with Jossie Telsch on Unified Field was given a pretty substantial dub makeover into Melt Down. Tracks like Out of Thin Air or Right's Day Passage have some more interesting textures, or Morphogenetic Funk feels like it lives up to its title. I don't know, while I'd be lying if I said this stuff gave me a lot to talk about, they were both very nice listens and very easy to zone out to and get sunk in all their dubby or trancey vibes as I can always expect from new Gabriel Lamar material. So if those sound like they'd interest you as well, give them a shot. I can give both albums a very strong 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Fred again, 10 Days. Okay, it's time to talk about Fred again. I don't think I've made it a secret that I've never been much of a fan of this guy. His rise to fame a few years ago felt like it happened so damn quickly and out of the blue, like one day nobody knew who he was, and then the next day everyone was calling him one of the most essential and game-changing producers in electronic music, and he was winning Grammys. And I just did not get what all the hype was about. His particular blend of house and garage arrangements was perfectly fine, but felt extremely standard and run-of-the-mill for either genre without feeling like he was giving them any kind of unique twist or executing them better than any other producers already on the scene. And his whole shtick of incorporating voice memo samples from his industry friends in order to create a feeling of intimacy and real life felt like such a mundane way to try and set himself apart from the crowd. His sudden explosion in popularity felt like a lot more of a product of a big marketing budget and being a nepo baby with tons of industry connections, such as his first big break coming from being Brian Eno's next door neighbor, rather than like organically blowing up off the quality of his music. Not that the latter situation is a thing that ever actually happens these days. The vast majority of artists who blow up to Fred's level of success already have a big marketing budget and or industry connections behind them in order to actually get people paying attention to them, and if you're born into a place of privilege with better opportunities available to you, I don't think there's anything inherently immoral about making use of them. I say this as Jamie XX and Floating Points are my current frontrunners for Album of the Year, and both of those guys had massive industry pushes behind them and tons of behind-the-scenes connections too. And not to take away too much from Fred's success, I mean, I did see a lot of people who did genuinely, like, really resonate with what he was doing. I was just never all that impressed with his actual music myself, with the exception of his production behind the scenes for Romy's Mid-Air album last year, which even I had to admit was very good across the board. As a lead artist, though, I just wasn't hearing what was so special about him that everyone else was hearing. That did also make me mildly curious about this latest album, since I was oddly seeing way more negative buzz around it. A lot of the people who I'd previously seen going to bat for Fred had really turned on him off the promise of this album, and I'd seen a lot of people calling this a major disappointment and letdown. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't really hear what's so disappointing about this album in particular either. It just kinda sounds exactly like everything else he's done, and I enjoy it exactly as much as the other previous work I've heard from him. Which is to say, it's decent, if not really anything special for the genre. There are a handful of tracks I do genuinely like on this thing. Adore You and 10 have particularly strong house grooves with decently catchy tunes. I like how Places to Be goes for a much more energetic drum and bass approach, and Anderson .Paak's guest performance is pretty striking. And Glow is a big 7-minute epic with contributions from Duskus, Joy Anonymous, Fortet, and Skrillex that makes pretty good use of its extended length. I surprisingly thought the cut with Sampha was a weak letdown, and the rest of the album just falls in the background and doesn't leave any impression on me. It's just nice house vibes with no real substance or anything interesting going on, and I doubt even the best tracks here are going to stick in my mind longer term. The production is fine, but nothing exemplary either, hitting that same odd midpoint between trying to sound lo-fi and DIY, but also sticking to a really currently trendy style and sound. But that's pretty much the exact same feelings I had on Actual Life 3 as well. I don't remember shit from that album aside from maybe Pull Me Out of This, and I had all the exact same observations on that album when I covered that, so I'm not gonna pretend like I know what about this felt like such a massive letdown to other people besides, I don't know, possibly being more of a revelation of his bland one-dimensionality as a lead artist. Which to me wasn't even a revelation, it's just what I already felt about him before. So, yeah, I guess take that as you will. I don't think there's anything essential here, but I don't think it's that bad either. It's just kind of a thing that exists, and I thought it was fine enough. I'll give it a solid 6 out of 10. Next up from Haunted Disco, If I Lived in Ignorance. I'm gonna be honest, this was originally gonna be on the previous roundup. I heard it once, hesitated on whether or not it actually fell under my format, and opted to hold off on it out of being too much in a rush to actually get that video out. Though obviously I decided to come back to it and try it again out of A, this being a somewhat obscure artist that I've covered a few times before, enjoyed in the past, and I don't imagine other people I follow are as likely to cover, and B, while this is definitely pushing it in terms of my genre boundaries, I did feel like it was just barely close enough to fit the format upon re-examining it for a second listen. Certainly closer to my format than that Labyrinth album which she put out 2 years ago and was primarily just a regular acoustic folk album. That album was also pretty solid if super depressing indie folk is your thing, but I felt like reviewing it would be too much of a stretch for my format in comparison with the older albums of hers I covered, like the abstract ambient sound collages of Pale Souls Glow in the Dark and the super lo-fi abstract trip-hop and bedroom pop of Nacien. This album is kinda in between the latter album's approach and that folksier sound of her Labyrinth album. Every track is based around guitars and the artist's own pretty solid delicate singing voice, but also around lo-fi synth arrangements and sampled breakbeats that can put it closer to that, like, Massive Attack kind of territory, I guess. It's also the kind of thing that if you just looked over it on Bandcamp, saw the description, or looked through the lyrics, it might appear pretty off-putting in how screamingly depressed and suicidal everything comes off. This is an album dealing in some very dark themes, which, to be fair, have kind of been a running thing for Haunted Disco's music, and longtime listeners of her stuff will be used to. But the actual music is much more accessible than that presentation would leave you to believe, at least say for one track, Waiting Game, which gets much louder and more aggressive than anything else here, with all these distorted guitars and crashing amen breaks. That one was a bit much for me. And some of the other traditional indie rock leaning cuts around the middle, like This Wasn't Supposed to Happen and One Gun Army, tended not to be my thing as much. But the album starts and ends really strong and delivers a lot of really pretty trip-hop and bedroom pop arrangements. Highlights include the synth organ-driven opener, which oddly gives me similar vibes to the Bonobo track All in Forms. I also really liked the dreamier synth-driven ambient pop of Portrait of You, the abstract interlude No More Dreaming, which gives off Seefeel vibes, or the much warmer piano-driven interlude No More Morning. The album ends with two of its absolute strongest cuts and the dream pop-centric Given Up on Love, which feels like the most well-developed and full-sounding actual song on the album, and the emotional piano ballad closer Bad Ending that has time to get a little drum and bassy near the end. Oh, and there was one rock-leaning cut I did really like called Death Rattle. That one just had a really nice delicate tune to it, and the instrumental had a little bit of a Pink Floyd Us and Them type energy to it. Overall, this is a really nice album, and it grew on me the longer time I spent with it. If this particular blend of indie pop is your cup of tea, then I can recommend giving it a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Halina Rice, Evolve. Next random Bandcamp find comes from this British producer that I actually first discovered through Bandcamp's new and notable section 2 years ago when she put out an album called Elysion, and I thought the album cover looked cool and bought it on impulse. Although that album ended up not sticking out as much to me as I hoped. It was kind of like a rival consoles adjacent minimal house record that had a bit of a dramatically downbeat mood, and while it had a decent amount of energy, it could run together and get a little tedious in spots, so I ended up deciding not to cover it. However, I still kept tabs on her just in case, and when I saw she'd released a new album, I decided to give it a shot as well, and found out it was a decent bit better than her last one. The sound of the album is pretty much exactly the same as her last one, still some fairly dark and blocky synth patterns and minimal house arrangements, but I did feel like there was just like a higher level of detail going into this one. A few more interesting ideas, some actual decent hooks, and just all around paced better to more effectively maintain my attention. Standouts include the especially hard-hitting and impressive opener Split, the somewhat catchy and offbeat vocal processing on tracks like Believe and Broken Vocal, the heavier burial-style garage beats on Theme, the somewhat tribal flavor of Swarm with its much rounder and more grooving bass line, the more abstract synth buildups on Synth Sounds B, and of course the random hyper-aggressive drum and bass track Hybrid that makes for such a big jump in energy to immediately grab anyone's attention. It's not gems all the way through. There are tracks such as Mod Sound, Sequence, Test, or Meld that, while still having a lot of dark and epic energy and color to them and effectively maintaining the album's forward momentum, don't necessarily have that much of a specific flavor to them to allow them to stick out more in greater context. And the track New Sunday is kinda limp and weak and fillerish, but yeah, even with these minor issues in mind, I did still have a lot of fun with this album. Even ended up getting a bit more replay value out of it than I often do out of impulse Bandcamp purchases. I do get the sense that she could go even further with this sound and develop it even more, find ways to make her style even more unique without as much reliance on the traditional house formulas, but this is some promising stuff. I can recommend giving it a shot. It's really good. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Kelly Lee Owens, Dreamstate. Alright, next up we got one from Kelly Owens. I've covered her a couple of times before and generally enjoyed her very stripped back and minimal house style with her own very airy vocal performances as seen on her self-titled debut and sophomore record Inner Song, although it wasn't until her third album LP8 and she made a pretty hard pivot into much more experimental and ambient territory that I feel like I really got her and her stuff started to click with me on a deeper level. That album obviously ended up as one of my favorites of 2022. However, it seemed she didn't feel like sticking with that more experimental direction and returned to a much more straightforward house and trance style for this fourth album of hers, which also marked her switching labels over to DH2, a new imprint of dirty hits started by George Daniel from the 1975. And the album featured behind-the-scenes collaborations from not only Daniel, but also Bicep and Tom Rowlands of the Chemical Brothers fame. And while I definitely enjoyed the results, I would be lying if I said this hit for me on the same level as some of her other work. Obviously, if you take it purely in terms of the overall sound and production, it's amazing. Super expansive and airy melodic arrangements and propulsive beats that very much match the album cover, being her first album cover to be in full color instead of black and white. And her especially dreamy, Kirsty Hawkshaw-style vocals are able to carry a lot of these tracks on their own, just as many classic vocal trance cut also does. Although as great as this album sounds, I feel like the actual ideas going into these tracks were way more straightforward and less interesting or individually striking than they could be on her older albums. This is very much an experience that runs together for me, and much of the track listing just kind of sounds the same to me. Again, it's a vibe I very much enjoyed, and it's not like there's no variety at all. You can get standard dreamy trance sort of instrumentals like Dark Angel and the title track, poppier cuts like Love You Got and Higher, ambient-leaning ballads like Ballad in the End and Trust and Desire, which hit less for me but were still nice. I think Rise brought up the tempo ever so slightly, and Time 2 brought in a little bit of break beats, but man, I'd really be struggling to have much else to actually say about this material. I feel like there's only so deep I can really go with it outside of how pretty everything sounds on the surface. It's still an album I can recommend. Chances are if you've enjoyed Kelly Owens stuff in the past, this will really hit for you, and especially if you're one of those people who thought her experimental turn on LP8 wasn't your thing as much, it'll likely feel like a return to form that also has its own identity that doesn't just fall in the shadow of her first two albums. I'm still happy with what I got here, and I'm happy to see her continue to evolve her sound. I guess I just wish the results clicked with me on a deeper personal level than they did. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this. Next up from TURQUOISEDEATH, Kaleidoscope. Okay, this is my second time covering an album by TURQUOISEDEATH. Back in the Volume 13 roundup last year, I covered their album Se Bueno after it had gotten quite a bit of attention through word of mouth through some of the communities I follow. It was a nice blend of big, expansive melodic atmosphere and crazy drum and bass breakbeat workouts with a lot of post-rock instrumentation thrown in for good measure. I did find the experience to be a bit on the samey side and ended up not really coming back to it, but I did enjoy it and found its expansive instrumental palette to be really spirit-lifting and emotionally resonant. When I saw they had another new album that had been getting buzz and I got a request or two to also check that out, I decided to give it a shot. What the heck? And I ended up enjoying this one more than their last album for reasons that weren't immediately obvious. In one breath, this is more or less the exact same kind of album as Se Bueno, and I'd have a lot of similar things to say about it, right down to also being pretty samey and most of my favorite tracks coming in at the very end, with that whole run from Leviathan Sanctuary being by far the album's most exciting banger, to the sentimental post-rock of So Far Away, into the 10-minute epic Underneath that seemingly has more change-ups and evolution on its own than the entire first two-thirds of the album combined. But I suppose one major difference with this album is that there's a lot less focus on the post-rock and shoegaze adjacent elements this time around. So Far Away is the only somewhat rock-leaning track on the album, and everything else is focused a lot more around the electronic sounds. Nearly every track is just a super spacious and open-sounding drum and bass arrangement that's extraordinarily pretty and propulsive and exciting. But I also think the key to this hitting more for me might have been the production, which I didn't think was any different at first since I didn't have any problem with the way Se Bueno was produced. But when I previewed through them back to back, I did feel like the sound on this one was even more well layered and deep and impressive, does a great job of setting up that greater sense of space. So, yeah, I'm kind of at a loss for anything else to actually say about this album beyond that, but at the end of the day, I enjoyed it. I can definitely recommend it if this sounds like it'd be your thing. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Photay, Windswept. Right now, here was an interesting find. This is technically the second time I'm covering Photay. I was first introduced to this guy's work when I covered his last album, On Hold, in the Volume 6 roundup, an ambient record made entirely out of samples of hold music. I did think that was quite nice, although I haven't heard any of his other work outside of that, and I had a feeling with a concept as specific as On Hold's was, I wouldn't have necessarily been introduced to him in the most indicative way. This album is so completely different from On Hold to the point of not even being recognizable as the same artist, much more of a standard minimal house record with a wide array of jazz instrumentation to accompany it. But between the bits I've previewed of his earlier albums and the fact that this artist recently put out an entire album with the jazz producer Carlos Nino, I feel like this album probably provided a more indicative look of what Photay was really all about. And it's really good. I was really impressed at the instrumental variety and uplifting vibes and various change-ups and evolutions through a track like Global Wind Trade. The track Airlock went for a crossover between drum and bass and indie pop that turned out really catchy. Thermal Loop was a really nice, peaceful and evocative mix of blubbering deep house bass lines, windy ambience, and well-layered flute arrangements. And Low Pressure System has another one of the liveliest and most instrumentally dense mixes, really leaning into the jazzier side of the sound with a really solid groove. Not to say I absolutely love this thing all the way through. There may be a couple of tracks like Barely There, whose ambient stylings, while still nice, weren't as investing as other more dynamic cuts here. There were tracks like Zephyr and Derecho, whose minimal house arrangements felt a little more on the plain side, although the former really picked up in its second half and had a really nice drop at the end of it. Also, I wasn't as big on the Bon Iver-style vocals that show up on a number of tracks, such as the entirely a cappella intro Forecast, which I felt more and more the urge to skip with each successive listen, and reprised on the closer Still Existing, which weren't entirely my cup of tea, even if the same vocal style was less of a personal turn-off on Airlock. I guess the hook was better there to make up for it. I don't know, but nitpicks like these are the only things preventing me from calling this album properly great, and I do think the best moments from this thing could enter into great territory. This might be the kind of thing I might want to keep around and see if it further grows on me. I think this is some promising stuff, and I can definitely recommend it as well. I'll give it a 7.7 out of 10. Next up from Perc, The Cutoff. Okay, next random Bandcamp find is this British industrial techno artist. He's released a handful of albums before this one, stretching as far back as the early 2010s. That all seem to be pretty well received, though this is the only project of his I've heard myself. Anyway, if you just want a load of ridiculously hard-hitting techno beats, this is going to be the album for you. For the most part, there's not much to say, aside from the fact that everything goes really hard. Highlights include opener Can You Imagine, creating a lot of tension with all these ambient build-ups and releasing it with massive hammering percussion. The track Static has female rapping from guest features Sissel Vincent, that was pretty fun. Heartbeat Popper has a lot of dramatic choir sounds going through its industrial techno mixes. Cold Snap brings in a whole bunch of crazy acid squelching, care of guest producer EAS. And Imperial Leather might be the most exciting banger on an album that's nothing but exciting bangers. Lots of aggressive, distorted synths and shouts on that one, which I found fun. The rest of the album doesn't necessarily give me much to say. There's a lot of industrial techno bangers which serve their purpose but don't necessarily elevate themselves to standouts, and especially in the album's last stretch it can trail off a bit with tracks that bang but aren't that interesting to note outside of maybe the ambient-ish closer. But still, even with that in mind, I definitely had a lot of fun with this album. It's just some good visceral banging techno that bangs more viscerally than the vast majority of stuff I'm covering in this roundup, and sometimes that's all you need. Worth giving a shot, overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. Next up from low-end activist, Municipal Dreams. Next random Bandcamp find is actually an artist I've covered before only earlier this year. In the Volume 15 roundup I talked about this Bristol producer's heavily gritty and atmospheric grime and OG dubstep and club throwback blends on an album called Airdrop, which he just put out back in April. Even if it wasn't necessarily a long-term keeper, I do still think it's very solid, and the mix of downbeat atmosphere and bass-heavy beatwork is all very well executed, worth going back to if you missed it. Now he's already got another album to immediately follow it up, which kind of looks to be marketed as more of a central event for him than Airdrop was. A fair bit more conceptual and ambient compared to Airdrop's more club-ready flavors, though tonally they're in the exact same vein. Apparently there's a big autobiographical angle to this one. The album is inspired by his time growing up in the Blackbird Lays estate, and the Bandcamp description goes into detail on how these tracks were directly inspired by specific aspects to his life in an impoverished neighborhood. From just a number institutionalized, being inspired by seeing friends and family get locked up in the prison industrial complex, to They Only Come Out at Night, sampling sounds of the car factory near to where he lived and where lots of people he knew worked at, to Broke, which has a spoken sample right at the beginning saying everyone I look up to are either junkies or criminals, to TWOC, which samples car exhaust and engine revving as allusions to how car theft and joyrides were a common source of entertainment that the youth in his neighborhood had to resort to out of a lack of anything else to do, or any finances or anything. It's just going out of its way to paint as realistic a picture of the grim living circumstances he had been raised under as possible, and clearly holds a heck of a lot more specific personal meaning for him than Airdrop did. With that said, much like that DJ Dance Alone project I covered earlier this year, even if it does feel like there was a lot more thought put into this project and its messaging, I think musically it's much less consistently investing than its predecessor. There are definitely some really strong moments here, many of which I already mentioned, from the hazy emotional ambience of tracks like They Only Come Out at Night or Broke or the album intro Lies and Deceit, or some cuts on the more banger-heavy side like the somewhat catchy patois shouting samples on Rush, or the heavier, almost hip-hop flavor to Just a Number Institutionalized, which are all solidly hard-hitting and attention-grabbing. And my favorite cut has to be the above-mentioned car engine sampling TWOC. Really creative idea behind that one, and it might be the hardest-hitting banger on the album to boot. But there were just as many tracks that just didn't deliver all that interesting an idea or felt too sparse or uneventful, be it ambient-leaning tracks that just kind of bounced off me like Innocence, Violence, or Climbing the Walls, or more beat-centric bass music tracks that can make some solid mood out of their unnerving emptiness but don't do much else for me, like Self-Destruction and Wrong Turn Dead End. Also, the 3 Hope interludes deliver a couple of bleeping melodic progressions that, despite the titles, aren't actually any less bleak or depressing in tone than any other cuts here, and they also kind of just bounce off me. To be clear, none of these tracks are bad either. I do feel like even the least interesting moments both serve a specific purpose in furthering the concept and maintain the bleak and hazy atmosphere the whole album's trying to set up in a way that's still subtly immersive so that I don't feel the urge to skip any of them. It's more of a case of certain tracks on the album grabbing my attention a fair bit more effectively than others. So, yeah, take that all as you will. Even if I had more conflicted feelings on this project than the other one I heard from him, I do still think I can sign off on it as another good album that's worth hearing, and I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from LP Giobbi, Dotr.
So nice to be in love.
Okay, LP Giobbi. One of the more minor surprises of last year was when I heard this Austin-based producer's debut album, Light Places, a collection of somewhat generic on the surface and currently trendy commercial house, following the direct footsteps of Odessa's The Last Goodbye, which should have blended into the sea of loads of other similar commercial house artists breaking out lately, but ended up bringing me back for more repeat listens than I would have expected. There was both a certain level of catchiness and emotional depth that did connect with me, with even a couple of tracks that went decently hard, and the experience ended up sticking with me and growing on me enough for me to be intrigued by the idea of a follow-up project only a year later. And even more of a surprise was to hear this follow-up and discover it was not just a step up from her debut in, like, every conceivable way, but also properly great. I mean, in one breath, Dotr is another helping of more the exact same kind of stuff as seen on Light Places, with an even more extended track listing, and for all I know could be like a collection of B-sides and material that didn't make the cut for her debut, but no track here feels like a mere leftover. Rather, it doubles down on all the aspects of that album I liked and leaned away from all the aspects of that album I didn't like as much. Light Places did still have a handful of tracks like If Love Is a Skill or Can't Let You Go that either felt too flavorless or too much like the soundtrack to a commercial to properly hit. That album was not winners all the way through, Dotr, meanwhile, despite delivering a much greater quantity of tracks, was a lot more consistent, and nearly every track hit for me in some way. Be it the breezy house cuts with soul samples or soul singers, like Been Such a Long Time and So Nice to Be in Love, which can stick in the head super easily, or Is This Love, giving me slightly similar vibes to You Love by J Dilla. Some proper propulsive bangers like Until There's Nothing Left, featuring some impressive belting from Alabama Shakes, or the disco-flavored Bittersweet with Portugal the Man, or the 6-minute instrumental Succession that has lots of really nice pianos and strings. And there's a lot of really nice lower-key emotional moments too, tracks with more understated indie singers like Feel and Love Comes Through, the latter of which really piles on the strings and the singer Panama kind of has a Sampha-like tone to their voice. Or the one really warm and sincere acoustic folk track 2 Days Older. There's honestly not a single weak track in the bunch. Not even the ones I didn't just mention. Even the interludes are all really nice. Not only do they further add to the album's sense of flow, nearly every track on the album already feels designed to segue into the next one. But each interlude is dedicated to someone special in her life, including 2 which are dedicated to her parents, with one having a snippet from her dad, and the outro taking from a Grateful Dead song, which she really connected with her parents over. But the other 3 are all named after women in her life that had recently passed away. Her mother-in-law, Patricia Lynn, a family friend, Suze Milliman, who was her first exposure to a professional artist, and her piano teacher, Carolyn Horn, who also gets a full track dedicated to her immediately afterwards. This is an album that centers itself around themes of family and grief and really nails it. I mean, I suppose I would get it if people heard an album like this and thought it was too plain or radio-friendly for their liking, but this very much hit for me in the same way as that most recent Moby album. A really introspective and emotional listen that hits the right balance of being downbeat and world-weary, but without falling into despair. Still delivering lots of strong dance grooves and vocal performances and catchy hooks, and just totally catching me off guard at the total lack of skips. Yeah, I did not see this coming at all, but this legit might be a year-end list contender. If Fred Again let you down earlier this year, then please check this out instead. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Machine Girl, MG Ultra. I've had a number of people request I check out this electronic punk duo from New York for quite a long time now. They've been around for roughly a decade now at this point, racking up a decent amount of acclaim and a pretty dang dedicated cult following through well-publicized albums such as Wolf Girl and You Void Synthesizer, among others. Though it wasn't until this latest album that I decided to finally check out what all the hype was about. I haven't actually heard any of their earlier albums. And I'm also told this might not necessarily be the most, representative look of what their greater catalog sounds like. Perhaps more easily accessible than they tend to be on average. But whatever, I wouldn't know. This thing had just gotten a lot of buzz, so I gave it a shot. And while I'd be lying if I said this absolutely blew my mind, I did have a fun time with it. The best way I can describe this album is like if George Clanton tried to make a later period The Prodigy album or something. It's very much an album centered around that punk attitude and being abrasive and not giving a fuck, while also getting the party going with lots of heavy break beats and bright synths and solidly catchy hooks. But they're also coming about it from a younger, terminally online Gen Z kind of perspective, covering all these mixes and dense walls of sound and making sure not to polish their sound up too much so as not to sound like the kind of thing that would reach a more mainstream audience. Also, the tone of the lead vocals kind of reminded me of George Clanton and Igloo Ghost if either of those guys decided to do something more punk-styled. It's an interesting mix, to be sure. I can see why a lot of people are drawn to it. Mind you, the album does mostly run together for me, and a lot of it is just bangers that go for a similar formula without doing something that's stuck in my head. With my taste being what it usually is, I did tend to gravitate away from the more abrasive moments like Cicadas and Grindhouse, which kind of bounced off me, and more towards the more melodic heavy tracks like Half Asleep, Ass to Mars, or the album closer Psychic Attack. The latter was almost certainly my favorite here. And there were some that kinda ended up working well in between those two sides, like the opener Until I Die, the sorta two-parter Mother Father, or the lengthier Schizo Dipshit that went on a little bit of a journey, but that's about as deep as my analysis is gonna go. Chances are this is gonna be the kind of project that'll go down a lot better for other people that have more of a taste for these more aggressive styles than I do, but I did feel a little distant from it and like it was the kind of thing I need to be in the right mood for. But I definitely get the appeal, and there was enough here that still connected with me for me to give this a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, from Renere, Release. Oh hey, Renere! It's been a really long time since I've heard new music from this guy. Great to hear he's still at it. A really long time ago, I did used to cover this indie synth-pop producer. I want to say back in 2018-ish, he put out an album called And Perish, which I did a video on, which was an extremely low-key and DIY-sounding bedroom synth-pop record that got really depressing in a way that felt pretty real, as well as having really strong hooks. And in the very first volume of the Some Stuff I Missed roundups, I also reviewed his second album called Feeling Only That Nothing Feels Fine, which saw him trying to get more sonically ambitious and try something a lot more Depeche Mode inspired. And even if he didn't really have the production to back himself up, he did have strong enough songwriting to still get it to work on some level. In the time since then, it seems like he's kind of tried to distance himself from the work he did before, taking everything he'd released off all the streaming services, but thankfully re-uploading everything into one giant early works archive compilation in 2021. I'm just glad he didn't outright delete his stuff from the internet as so many other no-name artists with self-confidence issues do. If you're really not feeling your old work anymore, that's a much better way to handle it, I feel like. But now, 3 years later, we finally get to hear what his non-early works might sound like. And while stylistically this EP is very much in the same vein as what he's done before, a mix of depressing low-key bedroom pop with dark wave influences and lots of nicely chill, blipping melodic synth work, kinda in between the approaches of his first two albums, I feel like in terms of the actual sound and production, this shows vast improvement across the board. The instrumentals feel a lot more well-balanced and given more body and creating more of a sense of space that kind of reminds me of that recent Seefeel comeback EP, specifically Everything Squared. I wrote this before Squared Roots came out. And the vocals sound way better too, not only because he finally got a proper mic and his voice sounds a lot clearer than it ever did on his early stuff, but I feel like he's gotten even more confident and comfortable behind the mic and sounds all the more natural going over these instrumentals. There were even a few brief moments where his voice started to sound a little Dave Gahan-ish. Guy has clearly come a long way since he started releasing music. My favorite moment is almost certainly the opener Placeholder, which he says is also going to make an appearance on his next full-length album currently in the works. Really strong tune behind that one, and the lo-fi and almost chiptune-ish synths create a really nicely immersive sense of space. I also really like the more dramatic performance he gives on Detalozed, and all the abstract radio static effects on that one. The track Stillness has a lot of really cool synth string washes that made that track really full sounding, and FFmpeg went for a much faster paced beat that stuck out to me, as well as his lyrics yearning to be both a real man and to be with another man. If there's any cut here I wasn't feeling, it was the closer Replaced. That has a good enough sparse and empty sounding synth wavy instrumental, and his vocal performances are nice too, although I don't think the track justifies being 11 minutes long. It doesn't really progress in a meaningful way over that time and just kind of meanders on, eventually losing my interest. Probably would have been more enjoyable had it cut down to like half of its running time. But whatever, that one issue aside, I was pretty impressed by what I heard out of this EP. I definitely recommend giving this a shot if this style sounds like it'd be your thing, and I'm excited to hear what he'll end up doing next. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from I4M2, Shut Up! Next random Bandcamp find is this artist who, by the merits of the album title and cover, I might have expected picked up from like a $10 request on my Patreon page or something, but I just found out through Bandcamp Daily instead, and it's actually got some traction and praise from a few other outlets too. Basically, if you want some aggressive electro type shit, this is gonna be for you. It's like halfway between like a classic early 90s IDM record and the distorted bangers you might hear out of like early Justice. Or if you've heard of the noise artist Park Zero, who I've covered in a couple of roundups in the past, it's kind of a similar vibe to that artist, albeit less abrasive than that artist's work. Really distorted and noisy stuff, but with the underlying dance grooves or melodies being the primary driving force of all these compositions, rather than simply trying to be extreme for extremity's sake. Cuts like Electro Loop and Fractured Light make surprisingly compelling ideas out of chopping up distorted guitar drones. Cuts like Business Name Generator and Crime Scene Walkthrough take a bunch of classic Detroit electro beats and absolutely blow them out. The latter adds in some neat piano samples, too. I really like the super heavy bass on Lost Data Frequency and the more ambient IDM approach on a track like Cult Filename, or the 6-minute bonus track Cooling Embers. And the title track goes for like this chaotic experimental vaporwave sort of sound that's really cool too. There are a couple of tracks that land on the less pleasant side for me, like Undefeated Theory or Synthrationism, which get pretty harsh and not as much in the fun way for me. But I'm overall pretty impressed with both the solid pacing and variety on display here. The album does flow very naturally and never feels like it's repeating the same idea twice, aside from the opener getting a reprise at the very end. This is some pretty interesting stuff. I'd say it's worth checking out. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Bug Bus Piano, Out Under Streets.
I guess we're just gonna have to wait.
And here's another random Bandcamp find. This is an ambient artist based in Seattle who's apparently been putting out loose tracks and EP since 2014, although this is apparently their debut album. Call this another case of album cover looking cool and me picking it up on impulse. Anyway, this is basically a collection of a bunch of really lo-fi found sound sample mashups and synth doodles that sort of have a similar feel to like Boards of Canada's old tapes comps or some of the more experimental ends of the mid-2010s vaporwave scene, all adding up to an extremely lonely and melancholic mood. There are a few exceptionally pretty tracks on this thing, such as the somewhat dramatic synth strings, pianos, and super slow 80s percussion of Wonder Streets, the warmer and cozier instrumental of Forgotten Battlefield that sounds pulled out of some different low-key 80s ballad, or a few super lo-fi but heavily emotional piano cuts like Ramparts and especially Life Underground, which also brings in a bunch of vibraphones. Always nice. Although as strong emotional notes as cuts like these can hit, there's just as many cuts that hit a very odd experimental note. Sometimes that's in the good way, like the opener and closer Life Above Ground and All's Said and Nothing's Done, which match together a whole bunch of different MIDI instrumentation and guitars to make oddly quirky and offbeat mixes that sound way less serious or downbeat compared to literally anything else on the album. I did appreciate the extra texture these bookends could add. But there's also a number of tracks that kind of just add to the lo-fi mood without really doing anything to stand out, like the somewhat generic drone of Sounds of Life as Heard from Below, or the barely coherent vaporwave instrumental of Dilapidated Graveyard being so broken up by static as if you're driving out of range of an AM radio station. And there's a few cuts that maybe had an interesting idea to start with, but kind of drag them out a bit long for my liking, such as the off-kilter and spooky 80s percussion and synth doodles of 23rd and Jackson Water Pipe Restoration Tunnel, or especially 1907 Urban Renewal Project, which has a lengthy narration discussing in detail the roots of the housing market crisis and various struggles of people who live in poverty, going over a repeating warm synth arpeggio. Easily the most Geo-Gaddy-esque moment out of any track on this album, although Boards of Canada probably would have left an idea like this as an interlude, and this artist stretched the idea out to almost a full 7 minutes. I suppose it makes sense, given the seriousness of the subject matter being discussed, but it did get kinda long-winded. But yeah, that's Out Under Streets. Bit of an all-over-the-place mixed bag and downer of a listen, but it is an interesting downer of a listen that had a lot of moments that struck me as compelling. I think there's something here worth looking into, especially if you are a Boards of Canada fan or if you're into those vaporwave or hauntology scenes that have that odd, spooky, homespun DIY feel. I will let this off with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Murcof, Twin Color Volume 1. Murcof is the alias for longtime Spanish ambient and modern classical composer Fernando Corona. This guy's been one of the more well-acclaimed names on the scene that's been recommended to me a number of times in the past, and I've been meaning to check out for years, but never got around to it. When I saw that he dropped a new proper studio album, though, I figured this would be a good time for me to quickly catch myself up on his old work, so I did just that. I didn't listen to every single old album of his. I decided to skip over his 2 film soundtracks, La Sangre Iluminada and Lost in Time, for the sake of saving myself some time, but I did listen to the 3 Sessions albums he has out, which were commissioned for art installations and the like, since those looked like they'd be more likely to be more easily digested in album form. Anyway, here's my quick thoughts on his discography so far. A really nice collection of glitchy IDM and modern classical elements. Really warm, emotional, and well-textured material. I really mess with it. It's great. A companion remix album to add on to Martes that also included 4 new original tracks in the same style. I didn't bother to listen to remixes, but I heard the 4 new tracks and they were all solid in the same ways Martes was. Like the last 2 albums, but even lower key and more downbeat. It's nice, although I liked Martes more. And this one goes significantly more minimalistic and significantly darker, fitting for the space theme promised by the title. I feel like this is the one I most commonly see marked as his best. Might need some more time to sit with these in order to figure out whether I agree, but I can certainly see why it gets hyped up given the 2001 A Space Odyssey vibes the whole thing gives off. This shows him doubling down on both the most experimental elements as well as the classical side to his sound, doing away with much of the synths and even bringing in opera singers. Bit much for my liking, but if you're a fan of, like, I don't know, 2000s era Vangelis when he was really going full classical, then you'll mess with this. This is a double album, mostly of dark ambient material, but it's a decently well-varied and engaging blend of it at that, going from stuff that sounds like 70s synth pioneers, to experimental string pieces, to even a couple of minimal techno arrangements and other ideas in between. If you're a fan of Coil's music to play in the dark duology, check this out, get kind of a similar vibe to that. Like the last album, but it's shorter and more intentionally frightening. Also, there's a lot of processed field recordings, apparently. It's neat, but not essential. Which brings us to here. Yeah, I think I got the hype for Murcof. Even if I didn't love everything I heard, I think Martes and Cosmos have a pretty good case for being classics, and all his other stuff was pretty neat and had a flair for making fairly minimalistic arrangements feel really dramatic and exciting. Now, this latest album I noticed had been marketed as his first regular artist album, not to be specifically commissioned as a soundtrack for something since Cosmos all the way back in 2007. Though it's also a tie-in for some kind of audiovisual project as well. I don't know what the deal is. Though it's clearly marketed as more of a big event than the Etna Sessions was, despite that album only just coming out this past August. This album is also marketed as him doubling down on a sort of cyberpunk dystopian sort of style inspired by 80s science fiction movies. Not necessarily unexplored territory for him, but the results are pretty dang cool. I think I describe it as similar to the more recent work of an artist like Itel Tech, or the more ambient classical leaning side of an artist like Clark, accompanying dark and bass-heavy synth arrangements with the usual mild orchestral instrumentation, although executed better than either of those examples. It's absolutely nothing Murcof hasn't done before, but it is probably his most consistently exciting work for me since Cosmos. The album does bookend itself with 2 especially dramatic ambient cuts that feature some nice airy vocal appearances, and other tracks like All These Worlds Part 1 and They Glow provide more dramatic ambience. The latter does get quite menacing and dark, and the former starts out on the more peaceful side, which is nice. Though the tracks that have more of an actual beat behind them tend to be the ones that pulled me in more, such as the more minimalistic dark synth rhythms of Cosmic Drifter, the comparatively almost somewhat playful approach to All These Worlds Part 2, and the flashy arpeggios of Nightbreak. Also, tracks like Tomorrow Part 2 and especially the 10-minute epic Enemy get really thunderous and propulsive. The latter is pretty clearly my favorite cut here. But yeah, there may not be a ton to analyze on Twin Color Volume 1. We'll see how Volume 2 adds onto it or contrasts it in any way in the future, I suppose. But in the meantime, this album is really good and one of the most engaging listens I've heard from Murcof in quite a long time. Grew on me a bit the more times I put it on too. It's worth checking out. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. Next up, from Flying Lotus, Spirit Box. Well, hey, we got a new set of tracks from Flylo. Only a quick 5-track EP, but that could still be enough room to deliver something interesting. Pattern and Grid World was only about 20 minutes and still delivered enough cool ideas to work. And, well, this EP is generally nice, though it's not really that much to write home about if you've heard basically anything Flylo's put out in the last decade or so. I don't dislike any of the 5 tracks. The opener, Ajusi, is a nice little chill deep house cut with a catchy vocal chop hook and a cyberpunk-y synth intro that made me feel like I was still listening to the Murcof thing I just got done talking about. Garman Bosia has a really cool instrumental with wiry synths and lumbering hip-hop beats as Flylo himself croons over it. I also like The Lost Girls with Sid Sriram, bringing in all this well-varied African percussion. Or is it Indian? I don't know. Though Let Me Cook is pretty instrumentally bland for him despite a solidly sensual vocal performance from Don Richard, and closer Ingo Swan is just a less textured and more background music-y take on the same idea as the opener. I do feel like these cuts could theoretically hit better in the context of a larger scale album experience like Flamagra. I stand by that album not being the disappointment many people say it is despite the quantity of tracks sitting around this level of quality. But as nice as all these tracks are, they don't really elevate each other in any way by being put together in the same package, and I wouldn't put any of this stuff among Phlo's best. This EP is just decent and not essential listening, and I'm overall feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Voljum, Global Tourist Assembly. Oh hey, we got a new project from Voljum. That's not a name I've heard from in a while, discounting his recent appearance on that last Hudson Lee album, but whatever. A few years back, I covered an EP this guy made in 2021 called Dayscapes. It was a really freaking nice, impressive sounding collection of glitch hop and neuro IDM, combined with a lot of super well textured jazz instrumentation. Basically along the same sorts of lines as an artist like Haywire. And now he's got another project, 3 years later, released with Upscale that's fittingly somewhat larger in scale. 8 tracks instead of just 4, although it's still only about a half hour long and he's still technically classifying it as an EP. So yeah, you can more or less copy-paste my feelings on his last project over this one. Unsurprisingly, the production and sound design is still incredible, still love the mix of jazzy pianos and horns with all these squelchy electronic effects, and it's something that is phenomenally well executed through all tracks on this thing. Makes it difficult to choose a least favorite. I do, however, think the project sticks to that one sound without really doing that much to iterate upon its core ideas as much as I'd like. Maybe tracks like Buchanan Nights and X-Wind have a bit of a drum and bass flavor in some parts, or Arbor Lumia theme gets more spacious and chill, or the closer R-port goes for something more experimental ambient leaning. Or maybe there's a cool contrast made with a lower energy Scapes 1 paying off into a higher energy Scapes 2, but that's about as much as I can glean in terms of telling tracks apart from each other, and he's not really trying to form hooks either, which could have also given these tracks more identity apart from each other. The slightly longer track listing did feel like it may have revealed some limitations in his style that wouldn't have been as obvious on a 4-track EP. But hey, at the end of the day, that's kind of just me nitpicking. Maybe I didn't have much to say about this EP, but I did all around enjoy it, all the way through, for the same reasons I enjoyed his last EP. It's still really freaking cool, and if this jazzy glitch hop and neuro style was your bag before, he'll give you more of exactly what you'd want. I can still easily give this my thumbs up, and I'm feeling a strong 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Luttrell, Life at Full Speed. Alright, next up we got a project from the Anjuna Deep roster, which I decided to pick up on a whim. Eric Luttrell has been at it for a minute now. He first gained notoriety as one-third of EDM trio The M Machine, and has been putting out solo albums through Anjuna Deep for a little while. I think this is either his 3rd or 4th solo album to date, but I haven't heard anything else he's done. This was kind of another case of me picking it up after thinking the album cover looked cool and seeing it on the pre-order section of iTunes for months. But the album actually turned out to be pretty dang solid too once I heard it. It's the exact kind of sound you'd expect out of an album released on this particular label. A lot of spacious deep house with big emotional melodies, loosely inspired by Luttrell's reflecting on his getting older and becoming a father for the first time. But it's all well constructed for what it is, and decently well varied too. Tracks can either get carried by strong sampled hooks as seen on Make You Happy or the stutter edit heavy title track. There are some lower key emotional moments with pretty piano backing seen on Sunrise Song and Something Right with Molly Moonwater. What started to grab me more was when he started bringing in more trance influences for some much harder hitting and more propulsive mixes seen on tracks like Falling, How Late Is Never, or Go. I kind of miss hearing tracks like these. I feel like we haven't been getting that much trance music in this sort of style in a while now, and they bang pretty dang hard. I also think the album ends up with a very pretty and cinematic feeling ending through the last 2 tracks, Day in the Park and the more down-tempo closer Butterfly, that both have some really nice inclusions of subtle string sections. Not to say every track is a winner, there's maybe a couple of tracks with weaker inclusions of vocals, such as French Bulldog. The idea behind that track is cute, writing a song about, meeting someone's dog and wanting to say hello, but the vocals aren't really able to sell it that much. And there's other cuts that had a more generic idea going into it, like Sunshine or Space, which just didn't really stick out to me as having anything especially notable in context. This isn't exactly a wall-to-wall winner on the level of that new LP Giobbi project, but it's still very good for what it is, and will hit in the same way as that project. If you're looking for some more commercial-leaning deep house and trance stuff with a solid emotional core and good hooks, then check this out. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Nala Sinephro, Endlessness. Okay, next we got a project that's been recommended to me a few times. This is an ambient jazz project released through the one and only Warp Records, composed by this British artist and producer who plays harp and various modular synths. I missed the boat on her Space 1.8 project when that came out in 2021, despite knowing it existed. But given I'd seen a particular amount of hype for this, I decided to give it a shot. And it's nice, I guess. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't maybe left wishing it left more of an impression on me than it did, though. The mix of warm synths, lonely saxophone performances, and really nice well-textured string sections with the occasional light drumming here and there is really nice and pleasant, very easy to sink myself in all the vibes it's creating, much in the same way as a project like Promises by Floating Points and Pharoah Sanders did. I know I'm not the first person to make that exact comparison point, though it's a very easy parallel to draw given they have nearly all the same musical ingredients in common, and both are multiple movement pieces designed to flow together as one continuous piece. Though Promises is way better than this, and it's not close. Not only did the repeating 7-note riffs going through that project make for a more memorable theme to center itself around, but I felt like there was more emotional stakes and variety in terms of the ideas it explored, while this one kind of just washed over me, went in one ear and out the other on many listens. I kind of don't really have anything else to analyze about it. But I don't know, I mean, while I was left wishing for something with a bit more substance, this is still nice, very well produced, and again very easily to sink myself in its vibes. Seeing how much this resonated with a lot of other people, I can probably recommend giving it a shot too, so I will just let it off with a very light, solid 7 out of 10. Next up from William Orbit, WFO. Okay, now here's a new release that sent me on a bit more of a roller coaster of emotions than I was expecting. I've gone through my history with William Orbit before when I reviewed his 2022 comeback album, The Painter. Go back and watch that video if you want further context. Did the full and brief segment and everything. But now he has a whole new album to throw at us. Although, something was different about this one. It's not quite as big of an event as The Painter was. There's no guest features, and he self-released it exclusively through Bandcamp. And while this was billed as a new album, I suspect it may actually be him digging through his unreleased archives. Not just because a lot of this material is somewhat unpolished on the mastering side in comparison with his best work, but on top of that, there are 3 tracks on this album that were just pulled verbatim from the 2 albums he originally put out as free downloads on SoundCloud back in 2014, and later deleted, never to make public in any form again. Those projects being Strange Cargo 5 and Orbit Symphonic. And yes, The Painter also pulled from material on Strange Cargo 5, but he retooled that material and made it feel like something new. This album just has unchanged re-uploads of 2 tracks from Strange Cargo 5 called Willow and Big Country, and 1 track from Orbit Symphonic, Movement 1B from that album, now retitled and called Orchestral Groove. Also a bunch of different scattered ideas from that album, kinda mashed together over low-key electronic beats in the track Adapted from Symphony, which is kinda neat. I feel like this should excite me more considering Orbit Symphonic is actually my personal favorite William Orbit album overall, and the track he did re-upload here was in fact one of my biggest favorites from that album. Orchestral Groove is my easy favorite on this album by default. But really the inclusion of these re-uploaded tracks just frustrated me since it's barely a taste of those, and there's still no way to hear those tracks in their original context unless you either resort to piracy or were lucky enough to download them 10 years ago like I was. I even looked into those deleted albums again on a whim while writing the segment and discovered on accident that he might be personally issuing copyright takedowns on people who re-uploaded material from those albums on YouTube. That threw me off to see. It has me wondering, why is he being that protective of albums he self-released as free downloads 10 years ago and then deleted all traces from the internet? Surely he's not embarrassed by them if he's finally going to share, like, a couple of them again here. including one of Strange Cargo 5's weakest moments in Big Country. Ironically, probably my least favorite cut in this new collection. But is there like some kind of legal or contractual dispute that prevents him from sharing that stuff in its original form again? Does he plan to release those albums again through a venue you can actually pay for them, like Bandcamp? I really hope it's the latter. Though while it's nice to hear tracks from those projects here again, the fact that we're getting these, like, just small spurts recontextualized into an album that otherwise comes off like the equivalent of a thrown-together SoundCloud dump ended up more worrying to me than anything. The stuff from those albums deserves better than how they're presented here, I feel like. But okay, as for the material I didn't already recognize, it can be a bit of a mixed bag as well. There are a bunch of tracks that kind of come off like skeletal royalty-free background music or just didn't leave any strong impression on me. But it does have its moments, and there's no track here that felt like a total skip to me. Highlights include Concrete Butterfly and A Bigger Splash being pretty exciting and propulsive bangers. Royal Flush has some cool inclusions of flutes and a quirkier energy to it that was fun. The Vigil sounded like it could have been an amazing immersive ambient cut if it didn't abruptly cut off after 42 seconds. Though I suppose the more open-ended ambience of the 10-minute closer Gleam of the Deep with all its semi-improvisational sounding guitars will do in a pinch. And the best track here that didn't already have the benefit of a decade of nostalgia was JD 800-000, a nice banging house epic that really went on a journey and had a lot of cool progressions. This album, at the end of the day, is still nice. I'm willing to say it's still pretty good, and there aren't any tracks here I disliked. Hell, I think this is a pretty comparable experience to Strange Cargo 5. That album may be better across the board besides the album cover, but you could listen to this and sort of get the general gist and vibe of what Strange Cargo 5 was like, I guess. It's just that the fact that this project exists in the form that it does, it gives me a weird feeling that eats at me. There are a few things that bother me, like an artist deleting their old art and actively policing that decision. Bad enough when labels or contracts mandated, but even worse when it's by the artist's own choice. And unless some time in the future comes when William Orbit is able to let those 2014 albums see the light of day again, this will just feel like a weird, scattered compromise that doesn't fully come together for me, so yeah, I'm overall feeling a 6.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Purple Disco Machine, Paradise. This is an album I picked up after seeing it charting well on the iTunes dance charts. I'd never heard of this German producer, real name Tino Piontek, before seeing this album. I know he's been at it for a while before this. He has, I think, 2 other albums. But the absolutely stacked list of guest features on this thing, including Benjamin Ingrosso, Young Bay, Chromeo, Kungs, Duke Dumont, Nothing But Thieves, Roosevelt, and even Nile Rodgers himself, had me intrigued enough to want to check it out. Just kind of a shame the album didn't actually turn out to be that interesting. It's a lot of very standard and run-of-the-mill commercial new disco productions that, while very nicely polished and able to deliver lots of solid grooves and a nice pop hook or two, don't really have any kind of special flavor to them that would set them apart as anything special for the genre. I guess highlights include the lengthier and more cosmic scope of tracks like Paradisco and Die Maschine. The former is probably the best cut here, and I like its not really interpolation of Donna Summer's I Feel Love. The groove and hook on Bad Company was one of the best ones here, despite being the only track without a featured guest. Higher Ground has some really strong bass. There were a couple of tracks that featured other legally distinct, not really interpolations of classic dance tracks, like Honey Boy pulling a bit from Stevie Wonder's Superstition, and All My Life pulling a bit from Depeche Mode's Just Can't Get Enough. The former of those, I guess I could mark as a highlight too. But that's about all the analysis I got. It's pretty nondescript as far as new disco goes. None of this is bad for what it is either. If you're fine with the total lack of personality and just want an hour of solid new disco grooves, it'll deliver that in spades. But if you want something that can elevate itself beyond that, and look elsewhere, I'm feeling a solid 6 out of 10 on this. Next up from Ut, Hiraeth, however you say that. Alright, got a new Ut album. This is technically my second time covering this well-known dub chill-out artist. I covered his last album, Heads, in the Volume 9 roundup if you want a bit more history. TLDR, as much as I love the genre this guy operates in, I've never found his music to stand out as much to me as his contemporaries like Spangle or Sounds from the Ground and all those. You can always count on him to deliver hyper-polished and well-textured production that sounds amazing in a vacuum, but in terms of the actual track ideas, most of his catalog kind of ran together to me in the same general vibe. This latest album isn't anything too far afield of what he usually delivers either, but I don't know, somehow this ended up connecting with me a bit more easily than most of his other albums tend to. It felt like there was a level of forward momentum this album had to it that other projects of his don't have to the same extent, which I found more exciting, with some further improvement in terms of the hooks. It's hard to describe, but it feels like a step forward for him. There may still be moments that don't really grab my attention, like Waxing Gibbous or We Crashed It Into the Sun, but I feel like there were more moments that pulled me in than didn't for once. The shifting chords of A Door in the Back of the Wardrobe were decently catchy. Muggy Boneheads with Belk and Bump had a lot of really epic horn sections. Camping 76 and Rake Twaiten Shop have some nice vocal chops that make for decent hooks, and the former has some cool ambient stretches. The Eternal Mrs. R was probably the album's most expansive ambient cut with a lot of warm pads and nice flute accompaniment. And the closer, What Will Survive of Us Is Love, made for both a catchy and emotionally satisfying finish to the whole experience. Probably the best track in the bunch, even if not necessarily by a long shot. Yeah, so I don't know what it was about this album that got it to click with me in a way that his previous work hasn't in the same way, given how similar it is to his other stuff he's done in the past, but I think there's a chance this could be my new favorite of his albums to date. I had more fun with this than I expected. Might not be a bad starting point to jump onto his work if you've never heard his stuff before either. I'll give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Bogdan Raczynski, You're Only Young Once, but You Can Be Stupid Forever. Alright, it's time once again to talk about this Polish-American IDM legend. A while back I covered this guy's previous album Adel in the Volume 8 roundup. This guy's work gets recommended to me all the time, and it's not difficult to see why. He was one of those early participants in the drill and bass movement in the later 90s, and is associated pretty closely with the much more popular names in the IDM scene like Aphex Twin, Outtaker, and Square Pusher. The former of those has directly gone on record to name Raczynski as an inspiration on his Drux album, and it was through RDJ's co-sign and signing him to the Reflex label that he first gained notoriety on the scene. Even if his popularity never came all that close to his colleagues, there are loads of people who will go to bat for him as deserving the same level of success. Though I'd never listened to his full catalog myself to see what the hype was about, I suspected Adel probably was not the best starting point to really know what he was all about, so I took the opportunity of this new album to finally catch myself up. And here's my quick thoughts on his discography so far. 70 minutes of stuff that sounds kind of like Aphex Twin's Vord Husband. You can see exactly where RDJ took his inspiration from. Album's a bit overlong for my liking and probably hit better in 1999 than it does now. I got kind of the same feeling off of this as when I first heard Plug's Drum and Bass for Papa. But I do like this a bit more than that album. If drill and bass is your bag, it's a pretty fun time. Like the last album, but with slightly better melodies and a couple of scattered inclusions of vocals which I did not really care for. That opener was legit difficult to sit through. Ugh. This is often considered his best, though I think it's just decent, sorry. More stuff like the last two albums, but in a way tighter and more direct package, running on half those albums' length. I don't see much love for it in comparison with the first two, and it does kind of derail itself in its last stretch. Domesticated Violence is terrible. But the length and lack of meandering on this one does it a big favor. I'd say it's about equally as strong as the first two. This shows him doubling down on the lower key melodic side to his sound, replacing the jokiness and irreverence of his earlier stuff with a lot more down-to-earth emotional vulnerability. It's pretty nice. This is a project originally made to look like a DJ mix compiling various artists, but it's actually just Raczynski doing all the usual irreverent drill and bass he's known for under 12 different aliases. It also feels like he's improving and making his sound even punchier than before, so yeah, I fuck with it. And his final album with Reflex shows an interesting turn with him taking influence from like happy hardcore and bringing in a bunch of brighter rave melodies. I also feel like the production was a noticeable step up from his previous work, more full sounding and not quite as lo-fi as what he usually does. Pretty solid. After a 12-year hiatus thanks to a bass drum incident that damaged his hearing, he came back in 2019 through the Disciples label with a compilation of unreleased material from his Reflex days. And honestly, given the extra production polish this material was given, I think there's a good case to be made for this as his actual best album. I mean, it's absolutely nothing you haven't heard before as far as classic 90s IDM goes, but the sound is done very well, and I could argue is presented in a way that's more engaging and approachable than his actual classics. Very good. And this was his first album of all new non-archive material since 2007, taking more of an ambient-centric approach that, while still nothing mind-blowing or among his best work, did grow on me a bit now that I've heard it in the context of his overall catalog, and seen how it has a pretty unique identity to set itself apart from his usual fare. So that brings us to here. I'll freely admit that even going through the guy's whole catalog, I still don't know how much I'm personally on the hype train for Raczynski. I don't know if I can currently say he's got an all-timer album in him, or even an album I properly love. May need some time to sit with some of these. But he is quite consistent. I've enjoyed most of his work on roughly the same level, and I think he's been getting better over time. Weirdly enough, I think his 90s stuff was actually among my least favorite of his work, the kind of thing that I felt like probably would have hit better at the time when the genre was still in its infancy, but doesn't really feel as impressive all these decades later now that the formula has been copied to death and improved upon. I got more interested from 96 drum and bass classics onwards as he started upping his production game. But yeah, that takes us to this latest album, a very quick and to-the-point collection of 18 short tracks adding up to 35 minutes of music, loosely inspired by his downbeat feelings at the state of the world in late capitalism, the helpless feeling of watching planetary collapse and livestream genocide while being surrounded by non-stop hyper-consumerism and trying to find what beauty you can in the world we have left. Boy, do I feel him on that. And yeah, anyway, the album's really nice. A collection of loose, low-key, melodic IDM sketches that have a bit of a melancholic tone to them, but still retain some catchiness. Kind of following after what certain parts of Adel did, but I think this improves upon those ideas. All 18 tracks are quite nice and deliver their own neat ideas, and none of them are skips. But particular highlights include the marginally meatier functional opener New Div, which has a lot of nice progressions and felt like a really strong mission statement for this album. I also really like the muted pads and banging percussion of Faroline, the emotional ambience of DJ Stews, the bassy sneakiness of Zaunthram, the squirting melodies and chords on Hundracision, the longer arrangement of Visions Revisions, which I weirdly don't often notice goes on for 5 full minutes, the heavy banging beats and wobbling bass of Fak, the playfulness of Shitwobe, and the tender closer Gauk, just to name a few that stuck out to me. I don't really have much else to say beyond that. It's just a nice collection of melodic IDM that's all well executed for what it's going for, and I think it can sit among some of his strongest work. Definitely worth checking out if you missed it. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Ozoyo, Worm. Alright, second day of filming. Next up, here's a returning name I first came across when I picked up a random EP they made called Cosmic Planta. I covered it back in the Volume 10 roundup. I thought it was very good, had a very nice and organic sound to it that kind of reminded me of carbon-based lifeforms and Flying Lotus, but now they've got a full debut album here inspired by, well, worms. It's a very Igloo Ghost-ish concept with some more influences adjacent to artists like Hudson Lee as well, I guess. This album may not be as well varied as Cosmic Planta, a lot of the experience can kind of run together for me, but it is a noticeable step up in terms of the sound design to make up for that. The bubbly ambient synth melodies going up against really organic IDM percussion and a couple of synth imitation woodwinds sprinkled all over the place make the album sound just as immersive and colorful and deeply layered as its album cover would have you believe. I enjoy most of these tracks on about the same level, but I suppose Flatworm meets Sea Slug and Bobbit Worm are notable higher energy moments. Bearded Fireworm and Slow Worm are notable lower energy and more emotional moments. Worms on Acid lives up to its title with all the classic 90s acid squelching. There's 2 collab tracks in Hammerhead Worm with Simocell and Spaghetti Worm with Foodman that both go over pretty well. I like the former's inclusions of Super Mario 64 sound effects all over the place. I don't really have much else to break down or analyze with this, but yeah, it's really nice. If this organic Sibient IBM or whatever adjacent sound is your bag, then I can definitely recommend giving it a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. Next up from SOPHIE, SOPHIE. Oh, I'm probably gonna regret wading into this discourse, but whatever. I have had a couple of people request I try this out, so against my better judgment, I decided to throw it in here. While Sophie was alive, she was the kind of producer who I had an immense amount of respect for how forward-thinking she undeniably was, although I never really connected with her music that much on a personal level. The product compilation from 2015 is absolutely fascinating to look back on and may as well have been the genesis of nearly every direction electronic music would go for the entire next decade, with absolutely stellar production and mastering. Rightly considered a classic by pretty much everyone, but also featuring a couple of moments that I personally found to be pretty annoying, such as Lemonade, among others. And her debut album, Oil of Every Pearl's Uninsides, was equally, if not even more fascinating in terms of the ideas going into it, getting even more daring and more experimental with sounds that I haven't even heard anyone else able to successfully recreate, and even higher emotional stakes where I have no trouble understanding how so many people found an absolutely transcendental experience out of it. And I would probably think was great myself, if not for the ridiculously treble-heavy mastering she settled on that, to me, seemed to directly undercut the effect that I would have thought she was going for. It was an album that should have had this big visceral punch and sense of off-kilter epicness to it, instead feeling weirdly hollow and off-balance in an unsatisfying or occasionally ear-scrapingly uncomfortable way that could instill the same feelings in me as something like Aphex Twin's Ventolin without feeling as intentional about it. And it wasn't even consistent across the record. There were tracks like Face Shopping and Pony Boy that were like brutal and intense in a way that was actually more full sounding. So I still don't know what was going on there, but as many people as I got angry with these takes in 2018, I was okay with not getting it. My personal taste obviously is not the be-all and end-all. Whatever didn't work for me clearly worked for nearly everyone else I talked to. And the world needs more people like her willing to take these genres into challenging territory like that, regardless of whether I end up actually liking it. So that made it no less shocking and devastating to me when I did hear of her sudden passing in 2021. I didn't make any statement about it at the time since I didn't know if I, as a longtime outsider to her fandom, was the right person to be delivering the message, but even I knew what a massive loss that was, cutting off all the possibility of this visionary producer to be able to explore her sound further. At the very least, I guess it's nice that the last thing she released before her passing was a remix of one of her earlier singles by none other than her greatest heroes, Audiker, and putting them out of their comfort zone with an uncharacteristically accessible spin on the track. So, you know, that's one heck of a high note to go out on, I suppose. Now, with all of that background, you might be able to understand my trepidation at wanting to cover a Sophie posthumous album. Not only did I already hold myself at a distance from her work to begin with, but I was not hearing great buzz from fans about how this project ended up being handled. There was a lot of talk about the album clearly being unfinished, or even feeling like a cash grab that went against her core appeal. All signs pointed towards it being a bad idea for me to even touch this one, but I gave it one listen out of curiosity, and I don't know if I would say it's that bad. Look, it's true that there is no way around the album being obviously unfinished. There are a number of tracks that just contain awkward, empty spaces where beats or synths are just repeating ad nauseum to fill a space where she was planning to put something else in, as seen on tracks like Do You Wanna Be Alive, or other moments where vocals are layered over repeating, underbaked fragments in an attempt to make it feel more finished, like on the track Raw. I do think it's safe to say this thing is not in a state that she likely would have been 100% satisfied with releasing if she were still alive, unless she decided to follow Ski Mask's lead with his ABCD series and just give her bits from the cutting room floor a home for the public to see. And it makes it kind of difficult to listen to in a very different way from any of her other stuff. Though the sentiment that releasing this in this state is a betrayal to what she was about as an artist or even disrespectful, I don't know if I'd go that far. Her brother Benny Long, who oversaw and mastered the project, did mention that she did have like 80% of this thing complete before her passing and was already planning to go in a more accessible, pop-friendly direction. So he did his best to make sure that the final released product stuck to her unchanged vision as much as possible. All the collaborators brought on board were people she'd already worked before while she was still alive, and seeing as she's not here to complete her own thoughts, he opted to leave the empty spots empty because no one else could do her ideas justice, which is probably true. And this approach does more to highlight the reality of her absence in a way that nobody can ignore. It's just a fact that she's not here to finish this album, so why even try to hide that fact? So in that sense, I really don't think this is quite as distasteful as people are making it out to be. All of it is still recognizable as her work, from the choices in synth tones and percussion and samples and whatnot. I completely disagree with the people who think that her direction isn't felt at all in the final result. There are even a solid handful of tracks that do feel finished enough and I ended up messing with. Especially among the poppier vocal cuts. See Live in My Truth, Why Lies, Exhilarate, and My Forever. I didn't think I was going to mess with those as much as I did, but they're probably the most finished sounding moments on the album and have pretty strong tunes to them. And the whole minimal techno section in the middle was pretty neat too. I think the track Elegance sounds pretty finished, a consistent sense of movement to that one with lots of different change-ups and no specific moment that feels like it was left empty. That one's probably my favorite track here. And the rest of this stretch feels like I'm walking into a dance club, except the venue is completely empty, you're in that building all by yourself, and the DJ set is just going automatically without even the DJ there to oversee it. Which, I mean, there is something poignantly eerie about the effect that does give off. I will admit the experimental ambient cuts in the beginning felt a little on the indistinct and tedious side, and she does find a way to annoy me beyond the grave with some of those chipmunk samples on tracks like Always and Forever and Love Me Off Earth. And the album as a complete whole is uncharacteristically long-winded for her. I know that's the way she specifically planned it, with this whole 4-act structure, but this album being over an hour in comparison with her way tighter previous work probably isn't helping matters for people. I seriously doubt this is the kind of album I ever see myself coming back to again. One listen was enough. But I didn't think it was that bad. I thought it was fine. I completely understand the people who were offended by this project's existence and felt like it tarnished her legacy or something. Perhaps it broke that image of perfection they thought she had before. But I also understand the people who did find something moving out of the scraps we were given here. I do see the vision for this album existing in the first place. I mean, on a personal level, I don't care if it's not jam-packed full of crazy details and sound design that I've never heard before. I think it's okay for a SOPHIE album to not be pristine and perfect. She was just a person. I half suspect there's an alternate reality when SOPHIE releases this album actually finished and it turns out to be disappointing to most people and not give the fans what they want. I don't think that tarnishes her legacy, and I don't envy Benny Long for trying to put this out in the world on her behalf and make sure her hard work and vision didn't completely go to waste, because this kind of situation is just always going to be lose-lose and make lots of people unhappy no matter how you handle it. At least he's confirmed this is going to be her final released work and there's not going to be any further milking of her vault beyond that. It is true that she deserved better than this. I completely agree with that, but I also feel that in the sense that she deserved to still be with us. She deserved to be able to finish this album or continue making music after that. But at the end of the day, we got what we got. Take it or don't take it, count it or don't count it. Whatever you want to do with this album, I will feel you on it. It's okay to cry. I'm overall feeling a solid 6 out of 10 on this. Next up from Seefeel, Squared Roots. Now, on the topic of less disappointing or divisive comebacks, we got an extra half hour of Seefeel to add on to what they were doing with that Everything Squared mini-album earlier this year. Now we got enough between the two to add up to a full album. I mean, this definitely sounds like B-sides to add on to that project, but they're all good B-sides. So You Shall Be and Touchless Tones have a lot of glittering and expansive melodic ambience. As X is Y is kinda like the former track with a light beat. Tail Trails creates a pretty big sense of open space with its reverb kicks and filtered vocals. Nerve Chasms and its shorter reprise Chaos Weary have a lot of sweet but mildly aggressive shoegaze guitar riffs. And Unfurled gets a bit darker, although still delivers the same mix of melodic ambience and percussion. The whole experience is admittedly pretty samey and tracks directly reprise elements from each other. It's not necessarily the kind of thing that stands on its own that well, but I enjoyed all of it. I wouldn't have minded adding a couple of these cuts onto Everything Squared to flesh out the running time a bit. So yeah, all of this is quite nice for what it is. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Ataurean, Birdy. You know, I feel like this roundup has featured surprisingly few random finds from Bandcamp diving. The vast majority of the artists I've talked about today I'd either heard about before or even covered before in some form previously. So let's throw in another name I had no prior familiarity with before seeing them featured in Bandcamp Daily like just 2 weeks ago or something. Ataurean is a Scottish downtempo producer. He's been at it for a few years and got a bit of traction putting out EPs through Chris Coco's DSPPR label, although I haven't heard any of his other work. What really caught my attention for this album was the story behind it, as he apparently made it on his laptop in the span of 2 weeks while bedridden in a hospital. He had come down with some unspecified illness that put him in massive pain. The initial scans came in looking grim, and the doctors told him to prepare for the worst. They put him under tons of different painkillers, and he was in and out of consciousness. Although, eventually he survived, the doctors ruled out the worst outcomes, and as the pain subsided for the last 2 weeks of his hospital stay, he made 1 track on his laptop a day, capturing his feelings on the spur of the moment. Also inspired by all the different birds that would keep showing up on the windowsill in his hospital room, including like one crow that would keep faithfully showing up. Now, admittedly, when you're in this kind of mental state, the kind of music that would come out of you might, by necessity, end up somewhat limited in scope, and every single track on this album is based around, like, the exact same blend of musical ingredients, mostly just warm ambient pads and synth harps playing somewhat simple arpeggios laying over each other, and there's basically no sonic variety at all. It's an album where every track sounds like the closing track from the Black Dog Spanners. But I will have to give him credit for finding a way to make the listening experience engaging anyway. Oftentimes the tunes and chord progressions themselves end up conveying enough emotional depth to be ear-catching anyway. And to be fair, it's not like all 11 tracks are literally copy-pasted from one another. They are able to set themselves apart from each other in terms of their general tone. Some tracks are more longing and sad, like the series of title track cuts, of which my favorite is probably just the opener. Others are more tense and fearful, like how Oyster Catcher and the end of Birdy Part 3 Cannula have these stuttery bass lines, giving them a surprising sense of propulsion. Some tracks feel like they're treading the line between hopeful and uncertain, like my personal favorite track, Crow. And the last 2 tracks, Time to Leave and Homeward, fittingly have a much more relaxed and relieved tone to them, and also bring in a few more xylophone-ish textures, which are cool. The album does maybe lose my interest a little bit in the middle, and given how one-note it all is, I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up not being a longer-term keeper, but regardless, I thought this was a really nice listen. I think it'll be worth a shot to hear if you want a more emotionally resonant, down-tempo experience like this. Wishing all the best for Ataurean's health going forward. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this. Next up from Ben Lucas Boyson, Alta Ripa. Next up we got a new album from Ben Lucas Boyson, sometimes known as Heck, H-E-C-Q. I primarily became familiar with this guy 2 years ago when I did a deep dive on his back catalog for a Patreon request on his soundtrack album Siren Songs, though not many people actually watched that one. When I did said deep dive, I was particularly impressed by the mainline albums he'd put out under his real name for Erased Tapes Records, such as Gravity and especially Mirage, in their evocative mixes of electronic and classical elements. So when I saw that he had another new album for Erased Tapes, I was all geared up to get into this one as well. And, well, it's good, but I don't know if I would put it among his best. It is another change of pace for him. After all his previous albums under his own name focused on classical elements, this one leans away from those and even more towards electronic sounds, which in theory should appeal to me even more, but I feel like his mixes became quite a bit less well-textured or emotionally resonant than I found them to be before. And it's not like a glitchy IDM record like what he did on his earlier Heck albums. It's a much more standard minimal tech house sort of record, adjacent to something like his label mate Rival Consoles would do, or maybe like a generic brand version of certain moments from John Hopkins' Singularity. Okay, not to make this album out to be like some really like boring generic snooze fest or anything like that. It is far from being that. It's a good time all around, and there's a lot of solid moments all throughout. I like how opener Hours starts out with this really melancholic ambient modular synth excursion before building into a marginally more epic banger. I like all the bass filtering and wiry shifting rave chords on Nox, which was probably the most memorable idea for an up-tempo track on the album. I like how Vineta brings in all these choirs, care of Tom Adams in its second half. And even if Fama's particular tech house sound design palette was very plain, I do think it had one of the more dynamic and exciting chord progressions, and the ambient pad surrounding the mix got quite cinematic. Also, strangely enough, I think my favorite track on this thing might have been the entirely ambient title track. That just hit a strong emotional note that resonated well with me. But there are other moments here like Mass and Quasar that, while good tech house in a vacuum, fell into the background for me in record time, and the ambient closer Mir felt like a pretty anticlimax way for the album to go out too. So yeah, while this album is solid enough for what it is and has enough moments that did hit for me to mark it as a good time, I'd just be lying if I said it stuck out to me that much in the greater scheme of the genre, or that I thought plenty of other artists in a similar vein have delivered something very similar in a much stronger and more engaging way, including Boysen himself. I know he has much better work in him than this, but I've also heard weaker material from him as well. I'd still prefer this over most of his soundtrack work. I can respect that he's continuing to evolve his sound, and it's obviously not like he wasn't passionate about the results. So, I don't know, take all of that as you will. It's good, just not his most essential offering. So I'll just let it off with a very light, solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Nicola Cruz, Kinesia. For the next random Bandcamp find, here's a really cool ambient breakbeat sort of project from this Ecuadorian producer. Supposedly his third album to date, though I haven't heard anything else he's done. But yeah, I had a lot of fun with this album. A lot of really neat darker atmospherics and well-varied beat work going through this one, and it keeps throwing interesting ideas at me, from the opener Miso, combining IDM beat work with live drumming over at 5/4 groove, squelchy bass synths, and light vocals from Machina, to Intra Taylor just sticking to one really satisfying and heavy organic break, to the much breezier and spacier approach to breaks and synths on Perma and Echo Distante, which have a very ski-mask feel to them, to Tudo e Ilusio, evolving from blipping modular synth melodies to skittering beats and dub techno synth chords, to biofeedback, bringing in all these bright synth squelches that almost border on being funky, and chopped up barely tonal flute performances, to Telepathine going full drum and bass, almost literally just the percussion and bass, but it goes pretty hard, to Chal, which brings in classic 90s acid synths and synth pads that make it almost feel a little like old school early 90s artificial intelligence style IDM. Really the only weak point in the track listing is the closer Suyo Perdido, which takes a lot of gong noises and turns them into a somewhat static and uneventful drone piece. Bit of an anticlimax closer, but I mean, if that's the worst part, that's still one very consistent listen. I will admit I'm not sure how much replay value this is gonna get going forward. I gave it a good 5 listens and I felt like I might have had my fill with it, but I still had quite a bit of fun with this. So on the merits of the creativity and consistency, I will give it a strong 7.7 out of 10. Next up from Nicolas Gaunin, Hootie Game. And while we're on the topic of very good Bandcamp finds from artists with very similar first names, next we got an album from this Italian producer who I found out about through his releasing on the Arte Tetra label, which I started following last year after Frent and Cantole by Mondo Riviera ended up becoming one of my favorite albums last year. The label apparently specializes in really quirky and offbeat exotica stuff like that, and this album is the latest edition. A concept record designed as a fake video game soundtrack starring a character who has to fight a giant serpent that eats everyone's souls or something. And the experience is about as bright and colorful and quirky as that album cover would lead you to believe. If you remember the existence of an outfit from many years ago called Visible Cloaks, it's kind of in a similar vein to that. Lots of well-textured and pointillistic arrangements of vibraphones, synth bells, lush strings, chopped up vocal samples, and various different hand percussion. All clearly plastic synth imitations thereof, but still maintaining a sort of organic edge. It definitely has a sort of video game-ish quality and sort of brings to mind imagery of Nintendo 64 era platformers like Banjo-Kazooie and the like. Highlights include the bassy vocal chops and strings on very indicative opener Hootie Ghosts, the lush synth harps and flutes on Roko Reike Taribaku, the somewhat more peaceful but very odd and offbeat vibes of The Goddess, featuring lots of incomprehensible female vocal snippets, the weirdly dramatic interlude Rakuto, the bassy percussion and heavy workouts of Snake Digestion, and the penultimate cut Nostalgia, which provides a mix of marimbas and strings and synth builds that ends up hitting a surprisingly strong emotional note, which ended up probably being my favorite cut on the album. Not every track here stands out in context, and I don't know if this is going to be a longer term keeper, but this was a very consistently interesting listen that definitely stood apart from the crowd of stuff I've been hearing near the end of this year. I can definitely recommend giving it a shot. I'm overall feeling a very light 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Nicolas Jaar, Piedras Uno y Dos. And how about we talk about one last Nicolas for good measure? It's been a minute since I've talked about anything Nicolas Jaar related. I want to say the last time I covered him was when I talked about his Cenizas and Telas album way back in the Volume 3 roundup in 2020. And even though historically I've been a lot more lukewarm on this guy's work than most people, given how much love he always gets among the semi-underground and music press kinds of audiences, it wasn't too much of a surprise that I got a handful of excited requests asking me to talk about this new double album set. Entirely made out of repackaged soundtrack material from the Spanish radio play he made called Archivos de Radio Piedras. The entire radio play has been available on his Bandcamp page since this past April, including all of the material from these two albums and some extra cuts. But I never bothered to listen to that as I don't have enough of a solid command of Spanish to be able to digest a full radio play. Even when I was taking Spanish in high school and had the language fresh in my mind, that would have been a massive challenge at best. And just to be upfront, I have not looked into any of the lyrics on these albums. I am purely going off the music. Though just taking Piedras Uno y Dos as out-of-context albums, what we got was definitely pretty interesting and not quite like anything I've heard out of Jaar in the past. Piedras Uno in particular sounds like Jaar's attempt at making a full-on Latin pop record, or at least the experimental equivalent of it. The instrumentals still stick very much to foreboding synth blends and clanging electronic percussion, but I think Jaar himself delivers his own vocals in Spanish on every track. It kind of reminds me of what Arca did on certain volumes in her Kick series, the second one in particular, while both being more sonically approachable and less mainstream sounding. For the record, I do not listen to nearly enough Latin music to know whether there are better comparison points to make than Arca, but that's just what came to mind. And the results are generally nice, I suppose. The vocals are fine enough, not distracting but not elevating these tracks for me, and the tunes in the early middle part of the album were all pretty solid with cool abstract downtempo instrumentals. Tracks like Piedras, Aquí, Agua pa Fantasmas, and Rio de las Tumbas. I could get behind all of those. Although the album's intro, Canguilon, showed Jaar crooning over a dark ambient instrumental which dragged on a bit for my liking. And the tunes near the end like Viento, Mi Viejita, and Song for Hope didn't pull me in as much as other tracks here. Now, getting into Piedras Dos, that's a very different album, taking all the same instrumental ingredients as the first volume and recontextualizing them in a much more abstract context with entirely instrumental pieces. And big surprise, I ended up enjoying this volume a fair bit more than the first one. The album starts out in experimental ambient territory with a track like Radio Chomio just being an abstract mix of light clattering percussion, which I found to be pretty nice. But as the album goes along, the pieces start to have more and more defined structure. Tracks like F Collect and El Azar are low-key melodic synth doodles, kinda sorta in a Boards of Canada adjacent vein, and the former lightly layers a few experimental noises and Latin percussion on top. And IU is a despondent electric piano-driven soundtrack piece that has some bass rumbles and percussion taps building into it near the end. But from there, he even starts to bring in more IDM percussion and deliver a bunch of dark atmospheric bangers, tracks like Heterodina and Sin Conexión, further ramping up the album's energy level before climaxing at the very end in easily its best moments in the interconnected SSS trilogy of tracks. Things get really percussive and intense and propulsive. The tracks keep evolving into new ideas. It reaches a level of excitement that nothing else on either of these albums can really compare to, and I frankly think it might have been worth it to sit through these just for those last three cuts alone. So yeah, that's Piedras Uno y Dos. I admittedly didn't go in expecting something I'd want to keep around longer term, and I don't think I got that either. On average, there's still more projects I respect for how they see Jaar flexing his creative muscles, but not ones that actually got more or less of a visceral reaction out of me than any other of Jaar's work I have heard in the past. But they're also some of the most easily accessible and approachable work Jaar's put out under his own name in many years, at least since Sirens, and even then I think these might be easier for me to wrap my head around than that record was. To be honest, I also have not listened to Sirens since 2017, so you can take me with a grain of salt on that, but still. These albums aren't keepers for me, but I enjoyed them. And Nicolas Jaar's longer-term fans who were yearning for something a bit more on that accessible side, well, this is no against all logic. I think those people might still be in for a treat. I'll give Piedras Uno a solid 7 out of 10, and Piedras Dos a 7.5 out of 10. Good stuff. Next up from Bibio, Phantom Brickworks LP2. Well, Bibio has a new ambient album as a follow-up to his Phantom Brickworks album from 2017. I did a video on the first one in case you're interested enough to go look back on that. It was a nice collection of very traditional Eno-style ambience and light Harold Budd-style minimal piano compositions that I found to be nice for what it was, if probably nothing altogether essential in the greater scheme of the genre. I was almost going to skip out on this sequel out of not thinking the original provided enough to work with where a sequel would actually be that interesting, but I got convinced to check it out anyway after Oliver from Deep Cuts put it on his Album of the Year list. And it turned out this is in fact a pretty solid improvement on its predecessor. While the tone and most of the sonic ingredients are exactly the same, I feel like there was a decent bit more variety in terms of the textures on display here, and the compositions felt ever so slightly deeper and more complex. At least I think so. I haven't listened to the first Phantom Brickworks in full since 2017, but yeah, there's a lot of really nice stuff here. The solo piano title track series continues with its 6th and 7th installments, and they're both nice. Part 6 in particular was a highlight. There's tracks with more warm synth pads like Opener Die Norwijk, which really hit for me and sunk me into the album's vibe pretty quickly. There's also tracks here that feature neat inclusions of vocals, albeit in the entirely ambient setting, like the choir-driven Dorothea's Bed, the choir and piano-driven Tegid's Court, or the somewhat menacing repeated grumbling sample on Suram, which was an interesting addition for extra flavor. Also really like how the cold and windy and muted synths on the track Brograve transitioned really well into the more dynamic piano performances on Spider Bridge. I kinda wish the pads from the former track continued to just stay there for more of the full length of the latter track, since hearing their sounds combined together was probably the best moment of the whole album, but both tracks are still highlights. There's maybe a fillerish moment or two like Lynn Paris or Psychter 1989, which deliver more emotional pads but don't really stick out too much. And as a whole, like this album's predecessor, it's not exactly the kind of listen that had me like itching to come back to it that much after I was finished. But, you know, I was pleasantly surprised by the level of depth on display here, and I got more out of the experience than I expected. So if you're as much of an ambient music fan as I am, you'll want to at least give this one a shot. I'll give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from LNHD, Slave Instincts. Alright, next random Bandcamp find. LNHD is a techno producer from Myanmar. She's also recorded some stuff under her real name, Lin Nandar Hatu. Sorry for butchered pronunciations as per usual. Apparently she had an experimental down-tempo mini-album called Jama Devi get a bit of traction last year. Sounded pretty interesting from bits I've previewed through, though this album is a bit higher stakes than that project. For those who don't know, and to be clear, I didn't know about this either until looking it up through the Bandcamp Daily article I found this project from, but Myanmar is currently in the middle of a civil war, and their military is more or less living out the purge right now. There's been absolute tons of death and terror and crimes against humanity and whatnot ever since the country got taken over by a military coup 3 years ago, and things have only gotten worse and worse with loads of people getting displaced from their homes. Don't take my word for it on the details, but there's articles out there. But still, the public living in the country refuses to completely give up on life despite how bad the crises have gotten, and in the middle of these crises, apparently a small but dedicated scene of electronic artists and DJs started to gain a bit of traction within the country's capital, Yangon, LNHD being among those artists. She's mentioned in quotes I read in the Bandcamp article that since regular people can't really do much about the way the military is acting, they've turned to music. They have a lot of anger within them and want to let their feelings out, and techno gives them an outlet for that. LNHD is now apparently a political exile from her home country, but has continued to find ways to explore her sound, incorporating musical traditions from Myanmar into hard-hitting industrial techno formulas. The results of which can be found on this quick little 7-track mini-album, adding up to about 25 minutes of music. And regardless of whether or not you know all the backstory behind it, the results are a fun, hard-hitting time, and the 7 tracks are all pretty solid for what they are and don't run together. Tracks like Digital Salvation Dream and Mutilate hit you with somewhat slow but heavily thumping industrial beats and unnerving bass, with the latter featuring some more unnerving screeching pads, which I thought were cool. There's some really heavy bangers like Lotus Dance and Holy Pole that remind me of the times that EDM artists from years ago like DJ Snake tried to incorporate Middle Eastern influences into their sound, albeit obviously with a lot more authenticity and not as obviously commercial. And there's lower key moments too. Tracks like Aftermath Lovers and New Wave of Exile lean away from the heavy beats and more into the pulsating bass and some classic 90s acid synths. And the closer Godly Torment gets pretty experimental in a cool way, switching from off-kilter intense ambience into all these chopped up gong noises and other broken up techno sounds. And yeah, overall, while I don't think this is necessarily the kind of listen I see myself keeping around longer term beyond this video, and other projects like that Perc one I covered earlier in this roundup might be able to give me more of a visceral thrill in a similar vein, I do think this deserves a fair bit more attention than what it's currently getting. It's pretty dang cool. I'm overall feeling a strong 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Drum, Meaning's Edge. Oh hey, Drum, now there's a name I haven't seen in a very long time. I was introduced to this well-acclaimed UK garage artist through literally my second ever Patreon request video for his then new sophomore album Portrait with Firewood in 2018. That album turned out to be one of my favorites of that year, and his mix of burial-style beatwork with lots of warm acoustic instrumentation, including strings, to really stand out to me as something special. And his debut album in 2013, Seven Lies, is also great if you haven't heard that before, maybe even better. The guy hasn't actually released much of anything since Portrait with Firewood, but this EP he came back with made a pretty decent splash. And while I wouldn't say this EP totally knocked my socks off in the same way his albums did for me 6 years ago, it is very nice. It's actually kind of hard to talk about this thing from a standpoint of individual tracks, since nearly anything can happen over the course of the 4 major tracks' running times, and they don't really have hooks to allow themselves to be easily identifiable from each other. But you're still taken on quite the well-textured journey regardless, that can zip around from thumping garage beats to bright melodic pads and tinkling bells to 90s acid techno, maybe some scaring footwork percussion with unnerving ambience that kind of takes up more of the focus on the track Crawl. And the guy also apparently pulled an Andre 3000 and learned how to play the flute in his time away, incorporating his performances in a bunch of different abstract contexts throughout the EP, especially prevalent on the final minute and a half of the EP, or also on the track Freakum Part 1, which also adds in bassoons and clarinets and hand percussion, and the whole mix starts to turn into something out of a Floex record before getting into a random wobbly classic-style dubstep breakdown. That was pretty sick. I don't know, while I do think his 2 albums obviously had more substance and left more of a memorable impact on me, and there are moments on this thing which don't really go anywhere that interesting, this is a very cool comeback, and one that lives up to the same high production values and impressively creative ideas that got me into his work in the first place. It already appears to have won in plenty of new fans that didn't know about him before, and I think that's deserved. So go check him out. This gets a strong 7.5 out of 10 from me. Next up from As One, Requiem. Next up, we got another project from Kirk DiGiorgio. This guy's last album under the As One name, called As One Squared, impressed me quite a bit last year, despite being a really standard mix of 90s artificial intelligence ambient techno without any twists. It just did that sound very well. If you're curious, I covered that album in the Volume 12 roundup and even gave him a mini in brief segment since he's actually been in the game for decades and there's a surprising amount of variety in his back catalog, with a lot more jazz influences being worked into his sound at various points in history, even if not all of his albums deliver something of interest. Anyway, when I saw he had another new As One album here, I decided to also give it a shot out of curiosity. And while just like As One Squared, it is absolutely nothing you have not heard before in the greater scheme of this subgenre, it's once again very standard and plays this old formula from the early 90s completely straight without any twists. I still ended up enjoying it on the merit of the tunes and melodies alone. They're very well melodically composed. Shout out to his frequent collaborator Catherine Siofra Prendergast, who apparently also contributed in that department. The track Swirling Mass has some really satisfying and breezy IDM percussion mixes that pulled me in quite nicely. Tracks like The Furthest Placed and Fractured Light had really bright and uplifting tunes that were quite mood-brightening while still maintaining a somewhat mysterious feel. Luminescence had a lot of really pretty synth strings that gave it a more cinematic flavor, and Our Ancient Future even had a slight bit more of a propulsive and epic tone to it that I really got wrapped up in. The album may not start or end on its most attention-grabbing notes. The title track makes for something of an anticlimax finish, and while I like how the track Message Received adds some bassy dub techno flavor, it isn't one of the more interesting arrangements, I guess. But yeah, that's Requiem. It's another solid collection of 90s style ambient techno that I enjoyed quite a bit, and given how this particular sounded genre hasn't been something that can impress me for its own sake for many years, perhaps that means something as well, so this is worth giving a shot. I'll give it a light 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Mimo Kama, Decimation of I. Next up, here we have a new album from Lara Rex Martin, aka Mimo Kama. So far, each new album I've heard from them has been a pretty interesting swerve from a concept album exploring both their Jewish heritage and anime-inspired cyberpunk themes into a classic mid-90s style atmospheric breakbeat record, and now we have their most ambient-centric record yet, a synth-backed sorta soundtrack-ish album with a lot of heavy modern classical elements. Well, I do think a few of these tones may have been explored in some way on some of their earlier albums like Ghost on the Stairs and Sleep Moss, but this one went out of its way to get even more dark and despondent, loosely inspired both by the ongoing climate crisis, as well as the novel Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, in which a group of characters explore a land that had been upended by alien visitors who we never meet, and those characters experience ego death, I guess. The resulting album ends up in pretty similar territory to something like Clark's Playground in a Lake, and for what it is, I thought it was quite enjoyable. Highlights include the freeform blend of woodwinds on The Poet, the super dark squelchy bass synths with string samples peeking through on P3 Alpha Exotoxin, the marginally warmer and more pleasant synth melodies of tracks like Spectral Alignment, contrasting with the bass-heavy propulsion on a track like Meditation. There's retro-futuristic 70s synth-inspired arrangements as seen on Journey to the Sphere, or the Mellotron Bach piece Area X, clearly a bit of a nod to Wendy Carlos there. Also quite like the stabby harpsichords on What Does It Want, and the off-kilter beatwork going over aggressively unnerving pads on The Gift. And the closer, As It Is Written, feels like something of a breath of fresh air at the end of a very foreboding journey with some nicer minor key pianos floating through the synth pads. There are other cuts that maybe don't stick out as highlights, such as the abstract dark ambience of Heavy Metal Offerings, among others. But there aren't any tracks that don't feel like they serve some kind of purpose in greater context, including the ones I didn't bother to mention. This project is well varied and well paced and pretty consistently in quality. Obviously pretty emotionally resonant too. While it's maybe not the kind of thing I see myself in the mood to listen to all the time, I don't really have much to complain about here. This'll hit quite well for those in the mood for some dystopian electronic classical crossovers, and I'll give this a very strong 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Caribou, Honey. And back to the opposite end of the tonal spectrum, here's the new album from Dan Snaith under his main Caribou alias. Those are always something of an event whenever they happen. I was looking forward to hearing this, given I have quite enjoyed most Caribou albums, especially from Andorra onwards to varying degrees. And while the deep house direction he seemed to be hinting at didn't exactly knock my socks off, I only heard the title track before the album dropped, I was still looking forward to seeing how that might play out, not just because of the deep house leaning cuts on his last album Suddenly being among the better moments on there, but also because his most recent album under the Daphne side alias called Cherry showed him really doubling down on the bright melodic house sound and ending up with loads of gems, some of which I semi-regularly come back to, such as Cloudy. Unfortunately, though, this new album turned out not to be nearly as interesting or engaging a listen for me as Cherry. In fact, it kind of just fell flat for me all around. Right from the first track hitting me with cutesy chipmunk vocals going over a bog standard deep house beat leading up to a really on-the-nose sample of Tom's Diner, I felt like that was a bad sign for what I was getting into. Though the rest of the album was just kind of boring more than anything. While Dan Snaith has had enough of a foot in the deep house world through his past decade plus of work where he can theoretically get away with an album like this and make it not feel like shallow trend chasing, if not for that fact alone, I would have totally accused this album of jumping on how commercially viable plain old deep house has been lately. And there's a part of me who wants to say that anyway because the substance really isn't there this time around. It feels so simplistic and watered down. The hooks are fine, but not really that sticky. The grooves are well produced, as they should be, but there's nothing about them where I'd be able to recognize them specifically as Caribou from a distance, instead of some random generic artists on Unity or something. Apparently, he also used some AI tools to make his own vocals sound like some standard airy female vocalist that you might hear in one of those commercial house productions. Which, to be clear, I do think is a pretty harmless use of that tech. I tend not to take that much moral issue with this kind of thing, for reasons I think I went over better in my recent Banco de Gallo review. But Dan Snaith has proven over the years to be a perfectly fine singer on his own. Our Love from 2014 was also a relatively plain melodic dance album as well, but his falsetto indie voice as well as the mild indie rock instrumentation peeking in through some various spots gave that album more of a flavor he could call his own. Meanwhile, processing his voice to sound like a female singer on this record only serves to make his sound feel even more generic and anonymous. Are there still highlights on this thing? Sure. The title track was co-produced by Photay and has a pretty satisfying drop with lots of nice bass wubbing. I liked the mishmash of vocal snippets on Come Find Me. The closer Got to Change was a solidly climactic finish with lots of thicker synth chords making a lot of nice build-up. And the best track was almost certainly Climbing, which cut its backing groove out of an old 80s tune and turned it into like a spacey disco cut a la Todd Terje or Lindstrom. But that's kinda about it. The rest of the material on here was just so nondescript to me that I'd have a hard time really breaking anything else down. It's just watered down versions of stuff I've heard him do better before, and considering the absolute deluge of quality house music we've gotten over the past couple of years, I would really struggle to point to anything about this record that stood out as that special. I admittedly don't know off the top of my head if this is like his worst stuff. He has had other pretty mid albums in the past, such as The Milk of Human Kindness. I remember not really messing with that one. And obviously none of this material is unlistenable or poorly crafted by any stretch. It'll still hit for people if all they need is the basic deep house grooves. It's not going to ruin your life if you hear it. You might even be put in a good mood by it. I'd rather not take that away from you if it did hit for you. But yeah, I personally found this to be one of his weakest offerings in recent memory, and if you haven't heard it yourself, you're not missing anything essential. I would much more recommend those like LP Giobbi or Luttrell albums I covered earlier in this roundup if you're in the mood for this kind of thing, and I'm overall feeling a 5.3 out of 10 on this one. Next up from Fennesz, Mosaic. So, somehow this is the first time I've talked about the legendary Austrian ambient producer and guitarist Christian Fennesz, one of the pioneers of that, I guess, shoegazier and glitchier side of this genre, alongside names like Tim Hecker, among others. This is a guy whose name I've run into many times in the past, and who has been directly recommended to me a number of times as well, though I never sat with anything he's made before now. seeing the release of a new solo album seemed like a good opportunity as any to catch myself up on his old classics. I will say that in the mini marathon I did do, I decided to just limit myself to his solo studio albums. He's released an absolute ton of collaboration albums, and while some of them, like the ones he did with, like, Ryuichi Sakamoto, do somewhat intrigue me, there's just too many of those for a quick segment like this. I'd like to keep this somewhat brief. Let me know in the comments if there's any I missed, which you really mess with and think I ought to go back to. But yeah, here's my quick thoughts on his solo discography so far. His solo debut from 1997 is like a microsound glitch and noise record adjacent to something Ryoji Ikeda would do, but a lot more open-ended and vibe-centric and less minimalistic or precisely constructed. I thought it was just okay, though the closer Aus is the easy highlight. Like the last album, but even more noise-heavy, with just enough melodic context and environmental flavor to maintain my attention better than his debut. I fuck with it. This was the point at which he saw a lot more attention and acclaim, though, getting more accessible through incorporating a lot more warm and nostalgic guitars or even occasional vibraphones into its glitchy abstract drone pieces. And big surprise, it's really nice and his strongest work up to that point. Like the last album, but doing away with most of the abrasive and noisier elements and ending up with a markedly more peaceful listen on average, even featuring a vocal appearance from David Sylvian on one track. I don't know if the further accessibility necessarily translates to being better, but it is once again very solid. I also like how the bonus tracks on the 20th anniversary reissue expand on the sound and aren't redundant either. Somewhere in between the last two albums, but even more expansive and cinematic feeling. Might be more re-listens to confirm, but I think this was probably my favorite of the albums I heard from him. Oh shit, the first track on this one has drums. I suppose this is probably the most pop an album of his has gotten so far, though it's still very much a noise-heavy abstract drone record. There's maybe that usual part of me who wishes for less distortion, but it's really nice. Not really sure why it isn't brought up more often. Nothing new from him aside from being structured into 4 long tracks, but still good, kind of on the more spacious Black Sea side of things. Which brings us to here. Well, I think I may need some more time with some of these albums to really let my thoughts digest more. Again, I'm not sure if I love any of them yet. On first impression, I am generally able to see where the guy's reputation comes from, and he has definitely released some quality work. Some of those are borderline noise albums that I still enjoyed well enough, so that probably means something as someone who is not typically drawn to that genre. This latest album, Mosaic, however, is one of his least noise-centric or distortion-heavy works to date. Possibly his most toned down yet, though it would be a pretty close call if that. And it's good. It's about as solid as one can expect out of a new Fennesz record, even though there probably won't be that much that goes against what you would already expect going into it. Delivers all the usual warm and spacious emotional vibes you'd want. My favorite cut on this thing by some distance is just the opener, Heliconia, making great use of its 9-minute running time with lots of nice evolutions through various pads and guitar manipulations that range from calm and peaceful to expansive and epic and anywhere in between. Though I also quite like the somewhat darker and more minor key tone of A Man Outside, and the track Patterning Heart feels like it may be acting as a sort of emotional climax for the album. I suppose the slightly bit-crushed tone of Love of the Framed Insects is nice. That track is apparently his experiment into odd time signatures and is in 7/4, although it's not like time signatures would really be noticeable for these kinds of compositions. And if you want the rougher edges to his sound, there's also Personare, which can get quite foreboding and distorted in moments, although my favorite part of it was just that last minute of the track, which does away with all the bass and feels like taking a deep exhale or lifting a weight off your shoulders. And the near 9-minute closer, Gonio Rizon, has some glassier tones to its filtered pads, which are cool, although that one doesn't really evolve much over time and drags on a bit. But yeah, that's Mosaic. May not be anything I haven't heard before plenty of times in this genre, and I don't know if I'd put it on par with his classics in the 2000s or anything, but it's well crafted for what it is, has its moments that hit those stronger emotional notes. And if you've been a fan of Fennesz in the past, this will likely hit for you as much as any other record of his can. Good stuff. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. And finally, from Sungazer, Against the Fall of Night. But as always, I like to end these roundups on a positive note. I know there's been a distinct lack of 8 out of 10 material in this video. It's just kind of been one of those years, I hate to say it. But thankfully I got one more 8 in me before the year goes out, so let's once again talk about fellow music YouTubers Adam Neely and Sean Crowder and their electro jazz band Sungazer. Back in 2021, I reviewed their debut album Perihelion. It was one of my most anticipated albums of that year, given how closely I follow Adam Neely's channel in particular, and saw how he was reincorporating the material from that album into his videos on music theory, with all sorts of off-the-wall polyrhythms and experiments into tempo and audience perception and whatnot. And I was so close to loving the results, but came up short thanks to finding the mixing and mastering a little on the underwhelming side, and ironically finding it lacking in bass. To be fair, it's not as bad as I remembered when I came back to preview through it now. It's more obvious in the project's second half than it is in the first, but it was still something that bugged me and prevented me from holding the album as highly as I wanted to. This follow-up album they've put out 3 years later, however, thankfully does not have that issue. The mixes this time around feel much more well-balanced and satisfying to maximize the level of excitement one would get while listening, and recapturing how the music feels when it's played live, and I have seen them live once, so I can confirm that. Also, where Perihelion felt like it had a bit of an educational edge to it, with song concepts partially meant to help demonstrate certain music theory concepts for videos, Against the Fallen Knight has no such feel to it of being half designed to tie into other content. This very much feels like an album designed to be played live and to be listened to in a more casual, out-of-context setting, and that's it. It feels like they made sure not to overthink this one. Not to worry, you're still going to get all the crazy polyrhythms and time signatures and off-the-wall, hyper-complex electro jazz grooves you'd expect. It wouldn't be a Sungazer album without that. But I just find it telling that the meme Adam ran with while promoting this album is, all music is in 4/4 if you don't count it like a nerd. Odd time signatures and polyrhythms are great, but they don't mean much if it's not coming in service to good tunes you can feel on that more visceral level, so here's an album designed to hit on that more visceral level. If there is anything that Perihelion might still have over this album, I do think that album was catchier and the tracks were more likely to get stuck in my head. Also, this album has a couple of tracks like Cool 7 and Scrunch that, while plenty of fun in the moment, feel kinda like the average of what you'd expect out of a Sungazer track, without really having that unique an idea to set themselves apart, either in context of the album or just their overall catalog in general. But there's way more hits than misses, too. The title track being a frantic stop-start attention-grabbing opener with cool uses of that old Windows 98 error sound. Whalefall is possibly the album's single most exciting banger, with some especially sick guitar solos care of Pliny. Though Hot Saturn is up there too, as they bring in Button Masher for a little bit of that chiptune video game flavor, and some speak and spell voices. There's also the slightly funkier feeling Whiskey and Mace, which has a lead horn riff, which is probably the strongest hook on the album. And one section near the end that I think kind of reprises some ideas from the title track. And Pejdushko Horo is of course our moment where Adam and Sean take some of their usual influences from Balkan music and really wearing it on their sleeves in a really obvious way, especially through how some of those fluttery, whistling melodies are constructed. But as great as all these bangers are, the real clincher for me was the somewhat lower key moments where the band is able to hit on a stronger emotional note, like the warmer and more tender closer Clock of the Long Now, and my personal favorite track, Oiteldonk, both of which feature some really freaking nice pianos care of guest keyboardist Pierluigi Salami. Excellent stuff. This album may not precisely be life-changing, and there's not too much here that's likely to surprise any longtime fans of Sungazer or any longtime viewers of Adam Neely's channel, but it definitely made my day a little better every time I have put it on. I think this could be in the running somewhere on the year-end list, and I am quite comfortably feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. And that is finally everything. That's the roundup. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something? Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.